Hey guys, tonight we slip back through the thick stone gates of a medieval monastery, but not as a novice scrubbing flagstones or a silent brother copying Latin under candlelight. No, tonight, you are the abbot. Imagine it, you've just been elected by your fellow monks, maybe through careful negotiation, whispered alliances, and a few conveniently timed divine signs. They slip a heavy gold ring onto your finger. You're handed a staff like a shepherd's crook, symbolic, of course, but trust me, you're about to do a lot of herding. And as the sun rises through arched windows, casting golden stripes over the cloister, the weight of the office settles in. This isn't just about prayers and peace, it's about property, politics, personnel, and yes, profit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your monastery isn't just a haven for the pious. It's a buzzing hub, a religious fortress, and, let's be honest, a massive corporate entity with land holdings that would make a medieval baron blink. You're not tucked away in some backwoods chapel. You rule from the heart of a self-contained empire, orchards, fields, vineyards, bakeries, barns, and bustling guest houses. Pilgrims pour in through the gates. Markets spring up around your walls. Nobles whisper your name in court. You're cloistered, sure, but hardly invisible. And the title? Abbot. From the Aramaic dabba, meaning father. But make no mistake, you're not just a spiritual daddy figure doling out blessings and barley. You're the top executive, the landlord, the CEO of a vast enterprise wrapped in incense and silence. Your desk is a carved oak table covered in wax-sealed scrolls. Your inbox? A steady stream of messengers from bishops, merchants, and panicking priors. Your outbox? Well, it's your right-hand scribe, whose wrist is already cramping from today's 8th copy of an official decree. Sometimes, you even seal those letters with a small signet ring, its image pressed into hot wax, a literal MIC drop for the Middle Ages. But how did you get here? After all, abbots aren't born, they're made. And it probably started years ago, when you walked through these same gates as a shivering teenager. Maybe your noble family saw the monastery as a good spot for a second son. Or maybe you came from nothing and had nowhere else to go. Either way, you took vows. You endured long hours of silence. You scrubbed floors, memorized scripture, and, if you were lucky, impressed someone important. Someone who whispered, that one has potential. Over the years, you proved yourself. You didn't just pray well, you managed well. You noticed when the sheep were sick. You balanced the grain stores. You remembered which steward cheated last year's tax tally. And slowly, your robe's thread count went up. Eventually, the position opened. The old abbot, rest his soul, either passed peacefully in his sleep or keeled over during vespers. The monks gathered. Names were murmured. Votes cast. And somehow, maybe through genuine love or just plain strategic elbow rubbing, you were chosen. Cue the ceremonial hoopla. The bishop arrives. Incense clouds the air. Your new ring gleams. There's a banquet, modest, of course, because you're monks, but maybe not so secretly opulent under the radar. Roasted fowl, honeyed almonds, spiced wine. No one calls it a promotion, but we all know what it is. Now you've got keys. Literal ones, dangling from your belt, which unlock chests filled with parchment contracts, relics, and a mildly suspicious amount of silver. And metaphorical keys, to power, to influence, to every decision made within and beyond the cloister walls. Because guess what? Your monastery is rich. Like, owns half the valley rich. And with that wealth comes complexity. You oversee hundreds of acres, tenant farmers, fish ponds teeming with carp, sheep that graze in coordinated flocks, vineyards producing wine not just for communion but for sale to every tavern within 10 miles. A quick side note, historians still argue whether the monastic wine trade was purely spiritual or a not-so-subtle side hustle. But hey, even holy men have to keep the lights on. You don't handle it alone, of course. You've got subordinates, priors, cellarars, bursars, and a terrifying old nun who runs the armory with military precision. Each one manages their corner of your ecclesiastical empire, but they all report to you. You approve the budgets. You negotiate with nobles. You make sure Brother Anselm doesn't accidentally give away next year's barley surplus because he misread the Latin. There's a rhythm to it. The bells ring out across the courtyard, echoing into the valley. Matins before dawn. Lauds at sunrise. Prime, terce, sext, you get it. But while the others file into the chapel for each service, you often slip away early. Not out of laziness, though, let's be real, those stone benches are murder on the spine, but because there's always something urgent. A land dispute. A visiting bishop. A pig that broke into the herb garden again. Third time this week. And yes, there's prayer. You're a spiritual leader, after all. But you're also a strategist. Every psalm you chant is followed by a plan. Every sermon you give is weighed against your community's morale. Every night before bed, you don't just ask for grace, you check the ledgers. Quietly. By candlelight. Because monks might not lie, but they do fudge numbers when they are bad at math. You live in your own quarters, more spacious than the others, though still simple by modern standards. A desk, a crucifix, a straw-stuffed mattress that's slightly less lumpy than the rest. Luxury, medieval style. Though between us, you've snuck in a wool cushion and an imported ceramic mug. Don't worry, no one's checking. And outside your abbey walls? A village that depends on you. A noble who owes you. A king who might need you. Because the church is power, and Abbot sit close to its pulsing center. What no one tells you before you take the ring is this: it's lonely at the top. Monks avoid you in the halls now. Your old friends speak more formally. You start second-guessing the motives behind gifts. That jar of plum preserves from Brother Matthew? Thoughtful, or bribery? And the prior who accidentally schedules meetings during meals, is that sabotage or just bad luck? Sometimes, you miss being a simple monk. But then you open the weekly tithe report, realize the barley surplus is up 17%, and sip your warm wine with quiet satisfaction. After all, you're not just any monk anymore. You're the abbot. So how did you get here? Let's roll the memory back like an old vellum scroll, back to your novice days, the scratchy robe, the constant cleaning, the slightly confusing Latin prayers, and the soup that always had too much barley and never enough flavor. You weren't born the abbot. You started small, maybe smaller than you like to admit. In the monastery's great hierarchy, you began as one of dozens of wide-eyed initiates. Most didn't make it. Some left. A few were sent home with kindly worded letters and slightly less kindly worded glances. But not you. You stuck it out. You endured. You even started to enjoy the routine. Dawn bells, silent meals, a copy of the Rule of St. Benedict tucked under your arm like a bedtime story. There's a peculiar peace in predictability, even if your feet were always cold. In the early days, your job was to listen and obey. If someone said sweep the cloister walk, you swept. If someone said clean out the pigsty, you did it, and tried not to breathe through your nose. You memorized prayers, copied pages in the scriptorium until your knuckles cracked, and stared wistfully out the window during long chants, wondering if the outside world really was as dangerous and sinful as everyone said. Spoiler, it kind of was. But also kind of fun. Here's the thing, even though you technically took a vow of humility, you weren't exactly not paying attention to how things worked around here. You noticed which monks got called into important meetings. You listened to how the cellarer negotiated with merchants. You watched the abbot closely, not just during prayer but afterward, when he lingered with a noble visitor, or slipped away with a steward to inspect the wine barrels. You didn't just want holiness. You wanted competence. Maybe even influence. And honestly, what's wrong with that? Even monks want to be seen. Now, climbing the monastic ladder isn't like in a royal court. There are no jewels or feathered hats or dramatic betrayals in candlelit halls. Okay, very few candlelit betrayals. But there is maneuvering. It's subtle, like chess played with incense. You show initiative. You offer to manage the herb garden when Brother Thomas gets gout. You volunteer to help copy financial records. Yes, they're boring, but you get to sit near the bursar and read all the juicy numbers. You make yourself indispensable, while making it seem like you're just being helpful. Eventually, someone notices. First, you're asked to assist the prior. Then maybe you're appointed to manage one of the outer estates. Suddenly, you're traveling, not just down the hill to the village, but to other monasteries, inspecting grain counts, negotiating sheep exchanges, attending synods where men in hats argue over calendars and fish. And all the while, you're learning how power flows. Who holds what purse strings? Which abbot is losing control of his lay brothers? Which one is suspected of, let's just say, creative budgeting? Now, an important historical detail here. By the 12th and 13th centuries, some abbots weren't chosen solely by divine inspiration. Many were elected by their communities, yes, but those elections? Not exactly free of earthly influence. Noble families lobbied. Bishops interfered. Kings sometimes leaned in. And historians still argue whether these elections were genuinely democratic or just holy versions of boardroom coups. In your case, it was a little bit of both. You'd proven yourself. The community liked you. You had a knack for leadership and just enough charisma to avoid being envied. But there was also the discreet visit from a bishop's secretary. The subtle push from a nearby earl who said, the abbey would do well under your hand. And when the old abbot passed away, peacefully, in his sleep, surrounded by whispered prayers and at least 3 concerned looks at the treasury ledger, your name came up. More than once. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was clear. The monks filed into the chapter house, robes rustling like parchment, and cast their little ballots. You waited in the cloister walk, heart thumping behind your scapula, pretending to examine the stonework. And then the door opened. Brother, someone said. They've chosen you. The ceremony followed within days. That's tradition. No time for power vacuums. You were given the crozier, the staff shaped like a shepherd's crook. A symbol that you would guide, protect, and discipline your flock. Which sounds gentle until you realize that actual shepherds carry those to poke sheep into line. The bishop anointed your forehead with oil. Choirs sang. The guest house filled with visitors. Nobles rode in from nearby estates with wine and letters of congratulations. One even brought you a falcon, which was slightly awkward because you don't actually hunt. You gave it to the falconer and asked him to set it somewhere symbolic. It ended up living on the barn roof. And then, the weight of it all hit you. The doors closed. The guests left. The robes went back to normal. And there you were, sitting at the abbot's table, looking at a plate of slightly congealed turnips and a stack of decisions that no one else wanted to make. Your first week was a blur. You discovered that the southern orchard hadn't produced apples in 2 years. That the monk in charge of the fish ponds had lost a full net's worth to a heron. That the village miller had been shorting your flour deliveries and smiling while doing it. You didn't panic. You acted. You replaced the fish pond keeper. You summoned the miller. You met with the orchard steward, walked through the frost-damaged groves, and drafted a plan to plant hardier trees. You wrote to the king's reeve. You hosted the local bishop. You adjusted the wool production quotas. And somewhere in there, you also led morning prayers, gave a sermon on humility, and made sure Brother Anselm stopped eating cheese before Carmpline. Because being abbot isn't about doing one thing well. It's about doing everything without looking like you're doing too much. There's one particular memory you keep tucked away, your first true test. A noble arrived unannounced, demanding a tour of the vineyard he'd donated money toward. The monks panicked. The vineyard had weeds, the wine was still fermenting, and the last shipment had spoiled. Everyone expected a disaster. You greeted him calmly. You poured him a different batch of wine, the better one. You complimented his coat. You walked him past the vineyard during golden hour, when even the weeds looked poetic. By the time he left, he'd promised to donate new barrels. Crisis avoided. Influence expanded. You didn't gloat. You didn't need to. You just lit a candle, sat in your chair, and whispered a thank you to the saints, and maybe, just maybe, to yourself. The bell rings before dawn, dragging you from sleep like a slow, ancient anchor being hauled from the depths. It's cold, always cold, and your bones feel older than they should. But you rise. You're the abbot. Everyone else can groan in silence, you have to look composed before you've even had your morning barley tea. Your day doesn't start, it unfolds, carefully and predictably, like the rule of St. Benedict told it should. But let's be clear, this isn't a day filled with quiet contemplation and uninterrupted prayer. This is executive chaos, in robes. The first service is matins, well before sunrise, when the sky is still more dream than light. You file into the choir with the others, your breath clouding in the chilled air. The chants echo off stone, reverent and eerie. You mouth the Latin, though your brain is already reviewing today's issues: 2 carts of rye missing, a visiting prior arriving from the coast, and that troublesome novice who keeps accidentally extinguishing altar candles. By Lords, the sun's cresting the hills. You've already had your first meeting, a hushed conversation in your private chamber with the cellarer, who explains why this year's ale tastes faintly of turnips. Not ideal, but salvageable. Then comes breakfast. A silent meal, unless it's a feast day, which it's not. Today it's porridge. Again. You don't complain, but you do sprinkle in some preserved plum from the abbot's personal supply. Perks of the position. No one says anything, but 3 monks glance sideways at your bowl. You smile. One of the subtle arts of abbotry is letting your luxury be just noticeable enough to establish authority, but not so much that anyone accuses you of being worldly. By prime, the day properly begins. Meetings. Letters. Ledgers. A visiting monk arrives with rumors that the nearby Benedictines have built a new scriptorium with glazed windows. You nod solemnly. Inside, you're livid. You were promised those windows last year. You make a note to write the glazier. Again. Let's talk about your morning desk routine. It's not just dusty scrolls and ink-stained fingers. This is your dashboard. One pile is outgoing letters, requests for timber, disputes about tithe distribution, a rather firm note to the reeve about not leasing abbey land to his third cousin again. Another pile is incoming drama. Petitions from local villagers. A complaint that one of your monks called a nobleman's wife worldly to her face. Accurate, maybe. Diplomatic? No. A report that the Westfields drainage ditch is flooding again. You write. You dictate. You delegate. And if you're lucky, you get 5 minutes to sit still while Brother Leo describes the condition of the fish ponds in poetic detail. The carp seem melancholy. Father. You nod as if this is a grave matter. You make a mental note to reassign Brother Leo to beehives. Terce arrives mid-morning, another service, another chant, another brief escape into the rhythm of divine time. But your mind is still in motion. You're thinking about labor, who's working, who's shirking, who's possibly been called to contemplative solitude just to avoid kitchen duty. After that, inspections. Sometimes you walk the fields, robe trailing through morning dew. Other times, you're in the granaries, tapping barrels and checking that the rats haven't found a way in. Today, it's the guest house. A visiting noblewoman is due to arrive next week, and if she sees a single loose stone or chipped goblet, she'll complain to the bishop, and the bishop will write you a letter, and you'll have to pretend not to roll your eyes while reading it aloud to your steward. Let's pause here for a strange but true fact. Many abbots, especially in larger monasteries, had separate kitchens. Not for gluttony, though historians still argue whether this technically violated the vow of poverty, but for hospitality. And your kitchen? It's busy. The cook's already stressed because the noblewoman prefers river trout and you're 90% sure your river doesn't have trout anymore. Might need to buy some. Again. Now it's midday. Sext. Another service, shorter this time. You sit with the monks in the choir, but your mind is buzzing with logistics. You consider the schedule for the next week, a tax reassessment, an archdeacon's visit, a rebuilding project for the crumbling north cloister wall. You wonder if you can shift Brother Oswin from candlemaking to stone lifting. He's clumsy with wax, but strong. Lunch follows. Still mostly silent, though you allow light conversation today. You even ask a novice about his Latin studies, which makes his face go pale. He forgets the word for praise. You offer it gently. He breathes again. Tiny lessons like this ripple outward, they remember when you show mercy and when you don't. Afternoons are where things get trickier. You're supposed to rest after none, but let's be honest, rest is for monks without inboxes. You take your break on the garden bench with a pile of parchment, half listening to the bees, half wondering whether you really do need another steward for the outer estate. You hold counsel. You discuss the new wall construction. Someone suggests hiring a local mason. Someone else warns that last year's mason drank too much and carved a very unflattering gargoyle of the prior. You table the decision for later. By Vespers, the sun slants gold over the monastery. You light candles in the chapel. The chants roll through the high arches like warm waves. For a moment, you do feel peaceful. It's the one time of day when the numbers, the reports, the complaints, all seem far away. You are not just a manager. You are a spiritual father. But then a lay brother slips you a note, a cart has overturned on the south road. It was carrying this month's salt shipment. You sigh, quietly, and compose a response before the last Amen. Dinner is lighter. Bread, maybe cheese, and stewed vegetables. You sit at the head of the table. You smile. You listen. You correct Brother Clement gently when he mumbles over grace. And afterward, you take a brief walk through the cloister under stars that will silently above. And then comes Compline, the final service. The last chant. The quiet dismissal. The long pause after the last candle is snuffed, when everything is still and the air feels thick with peace and dust and centuries of breath. You return to your room. You write one last letter by flickering light. You fold it. Seal it. You look at your bed, simple and narrow. You lie down. And you think, tomorrow, we begin again. You don't run a monastery. You are the monastery. And the rhythm of your day is the heartbeat of everything within these walls. You step out into the cloister walk early the next morning, stretching under a sky still rinsing off the night. Beyond the thick stone walls of your monastery lies the true source of your power, not your robes, not your title, not even the reliquary with the questionably authentic thumb bone of St. Barnabas. No, it's land. Acres and acres of it. Orchards, vineyards, pastures, forests, mills, and villages, land that you, as Abbot, oversee with the solemn pride of a medieval landlord crossed with a spiritual CFO. The church doesn't just own spiritual real estate. It owns real estate. By your time in the Middle Ages, many monasteries had become some of the wealthiest landholders in Europe. And your abbey? It's practically a regional powerhouse. People come to you not just to save their souls, but to lease a field, get grain milled, or ask for permission to graze their sheep in one of your green, sacred valleys. And let's be clear, this isn't passive income. It's full-on, spreadsheet in scroll form, boots in the mud logistics. You, dear Abbot, are managing a property empire that sprawls across rivers and hills and sometimes even into disputed territories where the boundary markers have mysteriously moved over the winter. There are whole villages, yes, plural, that tithe directly to your monastery. Their rents arrive in bundles of coin, barrels of ale, sacks of barley, and occasionally one very smug goose with a ribbon around its neck. A gift from the Reeve's daughter. Still hisses at everyone but you. When people talk about church land, they often imagine quiet fields with crosses. But your lands are economic machines. You've got tenant farmers working the fields, some hereditary, some hired. You've got bonded labourers, shepherds, millers, and foresters, all attached to monastic properties. And while technically you're not a feudal lord, in practice, oh, you walk the walk. You hold court on land disputes. You grant grazing rights. You oversee boundary markers and confirm which family gets to harvest which strip of field under the three-field system. And every autumn, you collect your share. And guess what? That's just local land. Your abbey also owns distant parcels, donated by repentant nobles who had too many sins and too few heirs. Some are miles away, managed by bailiffs or stewards who send you detailed reports, mostly about weather, bandits, and why this year's apple yield was not spiritually but practically cursed. This land gives you leverage. Nobles want your prayers, sure, but they really want your barns full and your storehouses stocked in case of famine. Kings, even, glance at your ledgers when considering military campaigns. And peasants? They depend on you in the most real way possible. If your fields fail, they starve. If your mills stop, their grain rots. You are their provider, their protector, and, on a bad day, their rent collector with a very concerned frown. Let's talk monasteries and forests, too. Forests are not just poetic scenery. They're critical assets. Your woods provide firewood, construction material, foraging spots, and hunting grounds, though the last one gets tricky. You're supposed to live modestly, remember? But sometimes a noble drops by and requests a hunt. So you smile, bless the hounds, and let them gallop through your forest while trying not to think about how many deer they just spooked away for the winter. Historians still argue whether all this landowning undermined the church's spiritual role or helped stabilize society by providing food and structure in chaotic times. Your answer? Depends who's asking. If it's a bishop, it was divine stewardship. If it's a local tax official, purely functional charity. You've learned to tailor your responses the way a falconer trains a bird, gently but firmly, always watching for signs of flight. One of the most powerful tools you possess as abbot is the cartulary, a hefty volume, handwritten by monks with ink-stained fingers, which records all the abbey's property holdings, rents, legal charters, and donation agreements. It is, essentially, your real estate Bible. You consult it frequently. You sleep with it metaphorically under your pillow. And when a local knight tries to claim that his grandfather never donated those river meadows to the abbey, you flip to the exact page, point to the dusty Latin script, and watch him deflate like a week-old cheese wheel. You're not above ceremony, either. When new land is granted, usually as penance for something mildly horrifying, a formal procession occurs. You and your monks walk the boundaries, chanting and placing carved stones. Sometimes, these stones disappear mysteriously in the night. That's when you send Brother Aldwin and his very sharp memory to remind people where the borders used to be. And don't get me started on mills. Owning a watermill is the medieval equivalent of having passive income with strong ROI. Everyone needs grain milled. Everyone. And guess who owns the only mill for miles? You do. And every sack of grain that passes through is taxed in flour, known charmingly as multure. It's a tidy sum. Just don't tell the peasant woman with 6 children that the wheel needs divine maintenance. She'll give you a look that sours even your best ale. Then there's the fish ponds. Stocked, seasonal, and sacred, technically, they serve both dietary and economic roles. Monks can't eat meat on fast days, but fish is allowed. So fish becomes your go-to protein, and also your export. Salted, smoked, packed in barrels. Once, you sold a full pond's worth to a Flemish trader who paid you in wool bolts and a pearl-studded cross you still wear on feast days. That's right, you literally turned fish into fashion. And while your land grants power, it also brings responsibility. A failed harvest? That's on you. A dry summer that turns barley to dust? You'll be rationing bread and comforting scared villagers by Christmas. It's a delicate balance, one part stewardship, one part luck, one part strategic planting. Your monks help, of course. The cellarer manages grain stocks. The obedientiaries keep track of tools, oxen, plows. But when the steward comes to you and says the southern pasture's being overgrazed and the sheep are fighting again, yes, fighting, you can't just shrug. You walk the land yourself. You listen. You arbitrate a compromise between wool quotas and grazing schedules. You promise to pray for rain. And maybe, just maybe, you slip an extra scoop of oats to the younger shepherd who looks like he hasn't slept in 3 days. You are the abbot. Your signature can grant land, lease a mill, or forgive a year's rent after a flood. Your word is law in the fields and forests as much as in the cloister. And at night, when you kneel beside your wooden bed and whisper thanks to the saints, you don't just ask for guidance. You ask for good soil, healthy lambs, and just enough rain to keep the crops from burning. Because in the end, your abbey isn't held up by stone walls or carved altars. It's held up by earth. And you, humble shepherd in a wool robe, are the one who keeps that earth alive. Let's talk money. Not gold coins glittering in a dragon's hoard kind of money, though if you ever do find a dragon's hoard, please donate generously, but the quiet, steady, ever-saintly stream of income that flows through your abbey like a divine current. Being a medieval abbot means being fluent in a strange dialect of sacred cash flow. Yes, you're committed to poverty, humility, and eternal salvation, but you also know the going rate for a good wool fleece and how much a barrel of ale sells for in winter. And honestly, you're good at this. Your monastery might not look like a modern business headquarters. There are no marble columns, no secretaries typing away on sleek keyboards, but functionally, it is one. Revenue comes in through many channels, and guess what? You're responsible for all of them. Every single cartload of goods that rolls through your gates, every ledger scrawled in Latin shorthand, every blessed fish that flops into a monk's net, that's your domain. So, let's peek into the sacred hustle. First, the big one, wool. You have sheep. Lots of them. You might not shear them yourself anymore, though you once did, poorly, and the sheep still give you side eye, but you manage the business. Monasteries like yours became major players in the medieval wool trade, especially in places like England. Why? Because wool was gold in sheep's clothing. The climate was ideal, and monasteries had the land, the labor, and the long-term thinking to produce wool in vast quantities. You don't just sell raw fleece to local weavers. You export it. Often across the Channel. Italian and Flemish merchants write to you in flowery Latin, requesting bales of your finest. Sometimes they show up in person, beaming with the exaggerated politeness of people who would absolutely underpay you if they could. You've learned to smile, stall, and pit two merchants against each other until the price magically rises. It's spiritual warfare, but with invoices. Then there's wine. Your monks tend vineyards in the sunniest pockets of monastic land, and while they claim it's all for sacramental purposes, you know better. Yes, the altar wine is carefully prepared and reverently stored. But the other barrels? They're traded, gifted, or sold to local nobles, traveling traders, and even bishops with suspiciously large orders for Lent. Your abbey's vintage isn't legendary, but it's good enough to command respect. You've even labeled it with a woodcut of your patron saint raising a goblet, tasteful, not tacky. Most people don't care that it's technically against the spirit of monastic austerity. They care that it doesn't taste like vinegar. You've built a brand, and you protect it. When one unscrupulous vintner tried to sell watered-down abbey wine from a rival estate, you sent a polite but very firm monk with a legal charter, a frown, and an unsettling knowledge of canonical law. Problem solved. Now let's move to ale. It's the real everyday drink in your region, safer than water, brewed fresh, and cheaper than wine. Your monastery has its own brewery. Small batches, carefully timed, and managed by Brother Guy, who has a nose so sensitive he once detected spoiled barley before it was even milled. You love him. You promote him. You give him access to your best storage cellar. The monks drink the ale. The villagers drink the ale. Visiting pilgrims rave about the ale. And a few merchants have started placing advance orders, 1 cartload per fortnight, if it please the abbot. It pleases the abbot, provided the cart doesn't wobble off the road again like last time. You still remember the puddle of wasted ale and the crying lay brother who swore the wheel just fell off. Next up, fish. As we discussed earlier, your ponds are essential. Monastic rules limit meat, but fish? Loophole heaven. You stock eels, carp, trout if you're lucky, and you manage them like a Wall Street broker with gills. Fast days, feast days, and everything in between, the church calendar ensures there's always a market. You sell to nearby manors, other monasteries, even traveling pilgrims willing to pay for smoked delicacies. But the fish ponds do more than bring in coin, they prove your ability to manage a renewable resource. It's eco-conscious. It's profitable. It's kind of miraculous. Especially when Brother Hugo hauls in a net full of surprisingly plump eels and declares it an answer to prayer. You agree, and quietly write a thank you note to the fish steward with a small bonus attached. Then come the rents. You own land, remember? That means peasants farm your fields and pay you rent in grain, labor, or coin. Sometimes all three. You collect these dues on schedule, with the help of stewards and bailiffs who keep meticulous tallies. Some of them enjoy the tallying a little too much. You've had to remind one that charging a goose handling fee during Michaelmas was not in the spirit of charity. Still, those rents sustain the abbey. They fund repairs, support the infirmary, and keep the novice dormitory stocked with clean straw and overly idealistic reading material. You track every penny, or groat or denier or whatever coinage is in vogue this century. Monetary systems are a nightmare. You keep a conversion chart under your candle holder. Other income sources include donations, guilt-fueled and otherwise. Nobles love to give. Sometimes it's land. Sometimes it's a jeweled crucifix. Sometimes it's a one-eyed mule named Rupert who bites everything except relics. You accept it all with the serene expression of someone who knows that spiritual credit is more valuable than cash, but still keeps a detailed inventory. Every gift comes with a string. A prayer. A promise. A plea for divine favor. You light candles. You say masses. And occasionally, you return a nobleman's wayward son in better shape than when he arrived, cleaner, quieter, and only mildly obsessed with Gregorian chant. Now here's the curious part, you never touch the money directly. Not in public. That's a hard rule. It keeps your image clean. You're a spiritual leader, not a merchant. So, you operate through channels, stewards, cellars, and monks who carry sealed purses to markets while you stay behind, sipping modestly and reading treatises on whether angels understand compound interest. They probably do. They're angels. But you do read the financial reports. Carefully. You keep a close eye on margins. You notice if this month's cheese yield is low or if the charcoal trade is unusually quiet. You don't panic. You adjust. You plan for the next quarter, the next liturgical season, and you make sure the monastery stays solvent through Lent, harvest, and the occasional outbreak of dysentery. Historians still argue whether monasteries like yours distorted the medieval economy or stabilized it during chaotic centuries. But no one disputes this, your abbey is a major player. Your financial acumen isn't greed, it's stewardship. You care for what you've been given. And if the occasional extra barrel of wine or gilded Bible slips into your vaults, well, Deo gratias. At the end of the day, when the ledgers are closed and the candles are low, you allow yourself a rare moment of satisfaction. Not pride, never that, but a quiet confidence. Your abbey is solvent. Your monks are fed. Your villagers are stable. And your spiritual mission, nourishing souls while balancing books, is on track. You don't just pray for daily bread. You budget for it. The bell rings again, it always does, and while some of the monks drift slowly toward the chapel, you head in the opposite direction. Not because you're skipping prayers, perish the thought, but because you've got an appointment out by the granaries. A minor crisis, 2 oxen have gone mysteriously missing, and Brother Edric insists they were spirited away by angels. You have your doubts. You're thinking more like spirited away by hungry peasants, or maybe sold quietly to buy a very fancy hat. Either way, someone's going to be very disappointed in a moment. Because while you're cloistered in faith, you're not isolated from labor. You run this place like a spiritual engine, and that engine runs on human effort. Your workforce is vast, diverse, and frankly, a little exhausting. Let's break it down. First up, the monks. Your inner circle. They wear the same robes as you, less nicely mended, chant the same psalms if a bit off-key, and live by the same rule of St. Benedict, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some of them are scholars, scribes, herbalists, or choir leaders. Others are, well, less ambitious. You know the ones, Brother Oswin, who always conveniently forgets when it's his turn to clean the latrines. Or Brother Anselm, who somehow ends up meditating under the plum tree for hours during labor duty. Still, they're your core staff. They've taken vows, just like you. They've surrendered worldly ambitions, mostly. But here's the truth, not all monks are made equal. Some are choir monks, the educated ones who pray, read, and occasionally write. Others are more hands-on, tending gardens, cooking meals, or helping with livestock. You gently manage expectations. You reward diligence. You discipline discreetly. And when you discover Brother Oswin slept through matins again, you reassign him to onion duty. No one escapes the onions. Next, the lay brothers, or conversi. They're not fully ordained monks, but they've taken simple vows and live at the monastery, usually on the outskirts in separate quarters. They do most of the heavy lifting, literally. Plowing, harvesting, repairing buildings, maintaining roads. These men are the spine of your abbey's physical operations. Without them, your wheat rots in the fields and your cattle wander into neighboring baronies. They eat separately, pray less frequently, and aren't expected to chant psalms in Latin. But they work hard, and they expect leadership in return. You show up. You walk the fields. You thank them. Sometimes you even help lift a beam, just to prove you're not made entirely of ink and sermons. They appreciate that. They won't say it, but you catch the nods. Respect is earned with every muddy boot print. And then there's the hired hands and tenants. These are local villagers who work your lands but don't live within the monastery. They rent fields, graze animals, or sell you goods. Many are tied to the land in feudal service, but you treat them with fairness, partly because you're holy, and partly because peasant revolts are extremely bad for business. They show up during harvest season in droves. They bring baskets, scythes, and hungry kids who dart between rows of barley. You walk among them, bless their work, and make sure the steward isn't skimming extra grain off the top. He usually is. You're working on that. Let's not forget the specialists. Every enterprise needs experts. You've got your beekeeper, Brother Wulrich, who names the bees and insists they understand Latin. You've got a blacksmith, a vintner, and a carpenter who only communicates in grunts and interpretive hammering. You let him. The tools are beautiful. Even your scriptorium, where monks copy manuscripts, is a kind of factory. Illuminated manuscripts don't draw themselves. You've got scribes bent over parchment, artists painting gold leaf, and ink makers brewing terrifyingly strong black dye from oak galls. They argue constantly about margins and decorative flourishes. You sometimes slip in just to stir the pot by saying, "I think this desk looks a bit off." Then you walk away. Pure chaos. Now here's something quirky, animal labor. Your abbey owns oxen, donkeys, sheepdogs, even the occasional stubborn goat who refuses to be herded. These animals are workers too. You keep records of their health, breeding, and output. One ox, named Matilda, has outlived 2 novice handlers and is basically a local legend. She gets an extra apple every Sunday. Managing this labor force isn't just about assignments, it's about morale. The monastery may be built on stone and scripture, but it runs on rhythm. Predictable hours. Fair food. Mutual respect. You give sermons that inspire. You write letters of recommendation for monks moving on. You even host an annual festival for the lay workers, complete with blessed bread, music, and a sheep shearing competition that always ends in disaster. Occasionally, things go wrong. A storm floods the fields. The vineyard catches a blight. A novice accidentally sets the bakery on fire. In his defense, bread and bricks sound similar in Latin. You don't rage. You respond. You gather the workers. You solve problems. You pray, and you budget for repairs. There's a constant balancing act between spiritual goals and earthly necessities. You remind your monks not to hoard honey, yes, even if they call it divine syrup. You discourage lay brothers from sneaking off to the tavern in the village, even though you do understand why they might want a break from boiled cabbage. Historians still debate how harmonious these labor systems truly were. Some say monasteries exploited their workers under the guise of piety. Others argue that monastic communities provided rare stability in a volatile world. The truth? Probably a little of both. You try to lead with fairness, but you're not blind to power dynamics. You use them carefully. You also mentor. When a young novice shows promise in arithmetic, you assign him to help the cellarer. When a lay brother repairs a wine press using only rope and prayer, you give him a bonus ration of cheese and a respectful nod. These small gestures build loyalty and legacy. One of your proudest days was last summer, during haying season. The weather was perfect. The monks, the lay brothers, the villagers, they all worked together, singing as they scythed. You brought out cider from the cellar. Someone played a psaltery. For a brief moment, the hierarchy dissolved. There was just sweat, sunlight, and the rhythm of the earth. It felt like heaven with a sore back. Of course, the next day someone broke the cider jug and blamed a squirrel, but still, you remember. So yes, you lead prayers. But you also manage plows. You oversee mass and mulching. You balance the choir and the compost. Your workforce isn't just bodies. It's hearts, histories, and headaches, all wrapped in wool and hope. And when you kneel at the end of a long day, tired and sore and probably smelling faintly of sheep, you don't just pray for wisdom. You pray for your people. Because an abbey is only as strong as the hands that hold it up. You're halfway through your lentil stew, lukewarm, a bit gritty, probably made by a monk with more zeal than seasoning, when Brother Hildebrand slides in beside you, clutching a scroll. You already know it's bad news. He only brings scrolls during meals when something has either burned, escaped, or collapsed. This time? A dispute over water rights, he mumbles. You sigh, set your spoon down, and mentally brace yourself for another tangle of property lines, and he said, he dug nonsense. Because here's the truth, managing an abbey isn't just about organizing monks and crops. You are also, very unfortunately, the landlord. And not just of one tidy plot of land surrounded by a polite hedge. No, you're overseeing an entire network of estates, each with its own squabbles, weather patterns, and highly dramatic tenants. Welcome to your fiefdom. Your abbey holds land, lots of it. Some of it you own directly. Other portions are donated by pious nobles hoping to buy themselves a golden ticket to heaven. You accept each gift with a gracious nod and immediately file it into your mental Rolodex of places that will one day start trouble. Estate management is its own beast. You don't sit in an office all day making decisions from parchment and theory. No, you visit. You ride out to distant farms, cloaked and slightly sore, nodding gravely as your steward explains that the barley yield is down due to unusual mole activity. You listen patiently. You ask questions. You note that the steward is, in fact, holding a new velvet pouch suspiciously well stitched for a humble farmer. Sometimes you send trusted monks to manage these properties, your own little satellite CEOs. Other times, you appoint a bailiff or reeve, semi-literate but savvy men who know how to keep serfs productive, barns dry, and taxes paid. They're useful, though not always ethical. You keep them close, and keep your own ledgers closer. Let's talk logistics. Estates mean revenue, but only if you can coordinate harvests, transportation, and storage. Grain must be milled and sold before rot sets in. Wool needs shearing, cleaning, carding, and shipping, preferably before the weavers begin staging tiny yarn rebellions. You handle contracts, negotiate fees, and occasionally smooth-talk angry townsfolk who claim your monks are grazing sheep on their common land. Unintentional overlap, you say. Blessed coincidence. And because medieval paperwork is less spreadsheet and more chicken-scratched Latin on sheepskin, you rely heavily on your cellarer, who controls goods and provisions. Think of him as your operations manager. He oversees warehouses, balances stocks, and complains about vinegar theft more often than seems necessary. You like him. He's detail-oriented and smells faintly of pickled onions. Now, about rents and tenants. Some villagers pay in coins, but most pay in kind, sacks of grain, a goat, or, on one memorable occasion, a barrel of eels. You really didn't want the eels. You still don't. You track who owes what. You enforce fair terms. And when a family falls behind, you visit personally, not to punish, but to understand. Sometimes illness struck. Sometimes the harvest failed. You judge carefully. Mercy is currency, too. Here's a fun twist: some of your estates aren't even close by. Thanks to generous donors, you might own a vineyard a day's ride away or a mill on land you've never seen. So, you write letters, diplomatic, firm, always ending with "in God's mercy." And then you wait. For couriers. For news. For someone to admit the vineyard's gone completely to weeds and now houses a very angry family of hedgehogs. One of the stranger facts you live with: you also manage churches that report to your abbey. Little parishes in outlying villages, each with a priest, a tithing chest, and usually one ancient widow who insists the altar cloth must be changed every Tuesday. These churches send you revenue and updates. You, in turn, provide support. You send books, advice, extra candles during feast days, and occasionally monks to teach literacy. It's like being a regional manager, but with more incense and fewer spreadsheets. Now, let's address conflict resolution. You're not just a landlord, you're a judge. Disputes arise constantly. Over fences. Over taxes. Over whose chickens pecked whose turnips. You preside over hearings in your chapter house, nodding solemnly while peasants shout about their goats. You listen. You discern. You give verdicts that balance justice and peace. Most of the time, people accept your decisions. On rare occasions, someone storms off dramatically, only to return sheepishly later with a sack of beans and an apology. Historians still argue whether abbots were truly benevolent landlords or just glorified feudal lords in fancy robes. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. You wield power, yes, but with constant awareness that you're supposed to model Christ's humility. It's hard to do when you're also demanding rent. But you try. You try when you mediate between a greedy steward and a starving tenant. You try when you forgive debts after a family loses their home to fire. You try when you decline the baron's offer to swap a valuable pasture, knowing full well it's a bad deal wrapped in flattery. It's not always graceful. You've made mistakes. Once you agreed to host a traveling merchant on monastery lands, only to discover he was smuggling dyed cloth without royal approval. Cue the royal taxmen. That was an awkward week. Still, you learn. You adapt. You implement better checks. You ask your cellarer to start tracking goods with a double-entry system, which he calls diabolical but effective. You promote monks who show financial acumen, even if their Latin is a bit wobbly. And here's something quirky: one of your most profitable estates is run almost entirely by women. A small convent nearby, led by an abbess who outnegotiates most of your senior monks and once scared off a band of tax collectors using only a wooden spoon. You correspond regularly. She's sharp, kind, and utterly terrifying. You admire her deeply. Your network of estates is more than farmland. It's a system. An ecosystem. Fields feed people who craft goods that fund churches that educate children who may one day enter your monastery. Everything loops. Everything connects. And as you sip your slightly too bitter wine, reading over the water rights dispute, you realize this isn't a job for someone who just wants to pray and garden. This is strategic, political, and occasionally, yes, absurd. But you're good at it. You adjust your robe, call for Brother Hildebrand, and prepare to write another strongly worded letter. Estate by estate, crisis by crisis, you shape the land, and the lives upon it. You wake to the sound of hasty sandals slapping against stone. Someone's running. That's never good. Moments later, Brother Felix bursts in, out of breath, waving a wrinkled parchment and stammering something about the bishop's messenger and urgent news from the archdiocese. You don't even need to open the scroll yet, you already feel that quiet, creeping pressure behind your eyes, church politics. Because while you wear a robe and wield a staff of spiritual authority, you are also a very minor piece on a very large and chaotic chessboard. And tonight, you're going to find out what it feels like to be an abbot inside the church hierarchy, a pious player with influence, but only if you learn the game. First things first, you report to a bishop. Technically, your abbey might have special privileges, many monasteries do, but no matter how remote or self-sustaining you are still under the umbrella of the greater church. The bishop can summon you. He can ask for reports. He can even gently recommend you host a procession in his honor, complete with expensive candles and uncomfortable small talk. But that's just the beginning. There's also the archbishop, several rungs above, who sends out grand proclamations and occasionally requests tithes or troops, yes, monks with actual spears, for various church-endorsed projects. And somewhere above even him sits the Pope, whose influence trickles all the way down to your abbey's rulebook, its liturgy, and whether or not you're allowed to decorate your altar with peacock feathers. Short answer, probably not. You navigate all of this through letters, carried by messengers who seem to appear only when you've just sat down to enjoy a moment of peace. These scrolls are laced with Latin so formal it might as well be composed by celestial lawyers. You read each line with care, trying to determine if that word means recommend or require. Spoiler, it always means require. One of your regular tasks? Defending your abbey's privileges. Over the years, your monastery has been granted various rights, tax exemptions, land ownership, the ability to appoint your own prior without outside interference. But these privileges are always under threat. The bishop may decide you're getting too independent. The local lord might try to argue that he actually owns the eastern pasture by divine inheritance. So, you keep a chest of charters, carefully sealed and preserved. Some are so old they predate the current king. You produce these when challenged, often with a dramatic flourish and the kind of smug smile only an abbot with receipts can wear. Let's pause here for a fun fact: some abbots had seats in Parliament. Yep, certain monasteries were so wealthy and powerful that their abbots were summoned to sit among the lords and clergy in the King's Council. If yours is one of them, congratulations! You now get to travel to court once a year and pretend to enjoy political theatre while secretly longing for your bees and your warm cell. Of course, traveling to court isn't just pomp. It's an opportunity to network, to protect your interests, and to observe the bizarre behaviors of nobles who've clearly never chopped firewood in their lives. You make allies. You strike quiet deals. You promise prayers in exchange for favors, and you trade honey and wine like diplomatic currency. One time, you even saved your entire vineyard from confiscation by giving the royal treasurer a barrel of your finest mead. He called it heaven in a cup. You called it emergency leverage. And yet, despite all your maneuvering, things still go sideways. The bishop insists on inspecting your monastery during Lent. You barely finish scrubbing the cloister floors before he arrives, trailing 2 priests and an air of aggressive judgment. He frowns at your manuscripts. He raises an eyebrow at your choir. He whispers something to his aide while poking a pot of your award-winning plum jam. You smile. You offer him your best guest chamber. You survive. The thing is, politics isn't just upward. It flows sideways, too. Other abbots are watching. Other monasteries compete. You hear rumors that the abbey across the river got a grant to build a new scriptorium. You suddenly receive a letter implying your monks are excessively involved in local trade. You feel the unspoken message, know your place. And here's where the real game begins. You respond, sweetly. You mention that your monks pray for their brothers across the river daily. You happen to mention your own scriptorium, which just illuminated a glorious bestiary. You include a small sample of saffron grown in your own gardens. It's not petty. It's holy diplomacy. There's also pressure from royalty. If a king visits your abbey, yes, it happens, prepare for chaos. Everything must gleam. The liturgy must be flawless. The bread must be fresh, the wine potent, and the stables clean. You once hosted a duke who insisted on washing his feet in sanctified spring water. You complied. The spring hasn't recovered. Now, you're also expected to write letters of endorsement. When the bishop wants to push a new tax, you're asked to support it publicly. When a young noble wants to enter the clergy despite being wildly unqualified, you receive a soft request to consider his vocation prayerfully. You walk a tightrope. You balance your conscience with your abbey's survival. You develop a talent for holy ambiguity. Historians still debate how political abbots really were. Some say they were pawns of the church's larger agenda. Others argue they wielded subtle but massive influence, shaping local policy and steering feudal decisions. You? You know the answer. You are both servant and strategist. You kneel in prayer, and then negotiate land use with the sharpness of a Roman senator. And let's not forget the ultimate political tangle, papal reform movements. At least once in your lifetime, Rome declares a crackdown on corruption, simony, or priestly misconduct. Suddenly, you're expected to enforce new decrees, burn old books, or publicize rules that contradict last year's rules. It's dizzying. You adapt. You gather your monks and explain that yes, again, Latin-only chants are now required. No, Brother Cuthbert may not lead Vespers in Old English, no matter how heartfelt. It isn't all pressure, though. Sometimes you get surprising moments of grace. A visiting cardinal compliments your leadership. A traveling scholar sends you a manuscript in thanks. The bishop unexpectedly writes to say he's deeply impressed with your stewardship of local lands. You read those words 3 times. You almost smile. And perhaps the most profound moment? When your monks, quietly, sincerely, tell you that your guidance helped them through a time of doubt. That your political maneuvering kept their homes safe. That your decisions, tangled though they were in hierarchy and diplomacy, brought real peace. So yes, you play the game. But you never forget why. Behind the scrolls and speeches is a monastery. Behind the politics is a place of prayer. Behind the title of abbot is simply you. And tonight, after sealing your reply to the Archdiocese and instructing Brother Felix to please stop bursting into rooms unannounced, you step into the chapel. Alone. Quiet. You kneel. You speak no words. You simply breathe. And trust that all your maneuvering might, somehow, serve the light. You're trying to settle into the evening psalms when the door creaks open and a boy no older than 12 tiptoes into the chapel. His robe is a bit too long, sleeves swallowing his hands, eyes wide with the kind of fear only novices wear like skin. You recognize that look. It's the "did I mess something up or is this just how things are now" expression. You motion for him to sit. He kneels beside you, stiffer than the wooden bench, whispering barely loud enough to hear, "I think I ruined the ink," in the scriptorium. You nod slowly. And just like that, your true job begins again, mentor, guide, teacher of the future monks. Running a monastery means running a school, a living, chanting, sometimes panicking school full of students ranging in age from impressionable boys to grumpy middle-aged novices who still haven't figured out which side of the spoon goes in the lentils. Some were given to the monastery by their families, perhaps as a spiritual calling, perhaps as a way to reduce the number of mouths to feed. Others came because they sought peace, or safety, or maybe just a bed that didn't leak when it rained. From the moment they arrive, they enter your care. Not just your abbey's physical walls, but your emotional orbit. You don't just feed them and assign chores. You raise them. You shape them. You determine whether they become kind, wise monks or quietly rebellious troublemakers who stash apples under their robes and mutter through evening prayers. Let's talk curriculum, because your monastery isn't just about chanting and weeding. You offer a real education, a medieval education, that is. Your younger students start with Latin grammar. Everything begins there, since Latin is the key to scripture, law, and all official church documents. They struggle, of course. Latin verbs don't play nice. You remind them gently that if they can memorize the entire Psalter, they can certainly learn third declension nouns. They learn reading and writing next. Parchment is expensive, so practice is first done on wax tablets or reused scraps. They copy Psalms. Then Proverbs. Eventually, they're trusted with full manuscript pages, guided by an elder monk who hovers like a hawk that also enjoys correcting penmanship. And then there's music, the heartbeat of monastic life. Every student must learn to chant. Not hum. Not mumble. Chant. In proper tone, with proper breathing. You walk the chapel aisles during practice, gently nudging shoulders, correcting pitch, occasionally sighing when someone decides to improvise Gregorian melodies with the confidence of a medieval Beyoncé. You also teach moral philosophy, quietly, subtly. Not through grand lectures, but through daily choices. Through how you correct mistakes. Through how you treat the elderly monk who drops his book for the third time that morning. Through how you deal with the novice who lies about breaking a window. Spoiler, the chickens did not fly into it by accident. Historians still argue whether monastic schools were progressive havens of learning or strict indoctrination camps. The truth? A bit of both. You teach discipline, yes, but also compassion. You model obedience, yes, but also curiosity. You allow questions, as long as they come from humility. When Brother Thomas asked whether angels could read, you paused and genuinely considered the answer. Probably. They were messengers, after all. Now, not every student becomes a monk. Some leave. Some were always meant to return to the outside world, perhaps as priests, perhaps as scribes, perhaps just as slightly more literate peasants. You bless them when they go. You remind them that the abbey will always be their second home. One boy left, only to return a decade later with a horse, a beard, and 3 bolts of imported cloth to donate. For the scriptorium, he said, eyes glinting. You didn't ask questions. You just smiled. Some monks, of course, don't learn. At least, not right away. They sneak food. They oversleep. They grumble through matins like it's a personal insult to be awake before sunrise. You don't banish them. You don't humiliate them. You do what good mentors do, you persist. You remind them why they're here. You ask them who they want to become. You assign them humbling chores that mysteriously seem to clear the mind. Cleaning the latrines has converted more novices than any sermon ever could. Let's not forget the elder monks, either. Teaching isn't just for the young. Some arrive late in life, seeking purpose. They are not easy. They come with habits. With opinions. With back pain. But you fold them into the rhythm. You give them manageable tasks, like sorting herbs or copying simple texts. They become part of the great teaching cycle, living witnesses of the rule, mentors for the next wave of novices. And amid all of this, your greatest challenge, and quietest joy, is nurturing vocations. You can't force someone to take vows. You can't trick someone into a lifetime of prayer and obedience. You can only show them that this life, strange and hard and full of cold stone and early bells, can also be profound. Can be beautiful. Sometimes, that moment of vocation happens unexpectedly. A boy looks up during Lauds and realizes the chant has filled something in him he didn't know was hollow. A novice stays behind in the garden, not because it's required, but because he's found peace in the rhythm of planting. A scribe lingers over a passage in Isaiah, copying it slowly, savoring every stroke. These are the turning points. You see them. You say nothing. But you feel the shift. One fringe tidbit you're particularly fond of: in some monasteries, students were taught using riddles. Real ones, with clever wordplay and theological twists. You've adopted the practice. Every week, you slip a riddle onto the dormitory door. Sometimes they're serious. Sometimes they're silly. What's as loud as a bell but weighs nothing? Answer: a novice snoring. The students love it. They whisper theories. They try to impress you with logic. One boy even wrote a song to deliver his guess. You pretended to scowl, then gave him an extra portion of bread. And perhaps your favorite task of all? Sitting quietly with a student who's struggling, not academically, but existentially. You've had these conversations by candlelight, after Compline, when the abbey is quiet and the only sound is the wind through the cloister arches. The student wonders if they belong here. If God listens. If this life matters. You don't give easy answers. You listen. You share your own doubts. And in doing so, you teach the most important lesson of all, that faith is not certainty, it's commitment. It's these moments, tucked between ink blots and singing lessons, that make all the rest bearable. The politics. The budgeting. The broken windows. Because here, in this humble corner of the world, you are building something that outlives you. Not walls. Not scrolls. But people. And tonight, as you walk the hallway past the dormitory, you hear a young voice practicing a psalm, soft, unsure, but rising. You pause. You smile. You carry on. You're awakened in the middle of the night, not by bells, not by prayer, but by a deep rumble that makes the floorboards quiver under your straw mattress. The storm has finally arrived. Rain slaps against the shutters like 1,000 tiny fists. You roll out of bed, wrap yourself in a woolen cloak, and open the door to the hall. Water's already leaking under the stones. Brother Simon skids around the corner, nearly loses a sandal, and yells over the thunder, the east barn roof is gone. So much for sleep. Because tonight, we dive into something most people forget about abbots: you manage property. A lot of property. The abbey isn't just stone walls and candles, it's a complex, sprawling estate that requires near constant attention. If being an abbot makes you a spiritual guide, a political chess player, and a teacher of souls, it also makes you, quite literally, a landlord. And medieval landholding is not some tidy, 3-paragraph ordeal. It's a messy, lead, dirt under the fingernails business full of unexpected cows, flooded granaries, and peasants who all claim their grandfather was promised that oak field in perpetuity. Let's start with the basics. Your abbey owns land. Sometimes a little, sometimes an entire cluster of villages. The land was given by nobles, kings, or pious donors hoping to reserve a few heavenly brownie points. And with land comes responsibility. Fields must be plowed. Orchards trimmed. Woodlands managed for fuel and lumber. Fish ponds stocked and rotated. If you don't keep track, chaos blooms like mushrooms after rain. You have reeves and bailiffs, laymen who supervise the day-to-day work. But you oversee the big picture. You decide when to harvest early, how to rotate crops, and whether to risk planting that newfangled rye variety the monks downriver are raving about. You must also watch the weather like a hawk. A poor harvest doesn't just mean hungry mouths. It means lost revenue, unhappy tenants, and a long winter full of broth so thin you can see the bottom of the bowl. You also collect rents and tithes. Most peasants don't pay in coins, they pay in kind. That means grain, vegetables, eggs, or wool. Occasionally, someone brings you a live goose, honking indignantly as it's handed over like a feathery tax form. Your cellarer records it all meticulously. You have an entire room just for storing cheese wheels. But property isn't just about fields and food. It includes buildings, too: barns, mills, forges, guest houses. And every single one of those structures has a tendency to fall apart. Roofs collapse. Doors warp. Rats chew through storage bins. You keep a team of lay brothers for repairs, but sometimes you roll up your sleeves and patch a thatch yourself. You're not above it. And frankly, sometimes it's easier than negotiating with Brother Anselm about the sermon schedule again. Oh, and then there's the sheep. You've got flocks. Lots of them. Wool is gold in your world. Some abbeys, especially in England, become so good at wool production that they trade with the continent. Yours isn't quite that famous, but you know a healthy ewe from a sickly one, and you've learned the hard way that naming them is a terrible idea. You never quite got over the loss of Matilda. You hold court over land disputes. One of your tenants accuses another of stealing firewood. A boundary stone goes missing, and now 2 families are screaming over 5 feet of disputed ground. You sit under a tree with your notes, trying to apply canon law, local custom, and a healthy dose of common sense. Sometimes, justice looks like moving the stone back and ordering them both to share the firewood. Other times, it looks like confiscating the whole stack until they learn to behave. Fringe fact of the night? Some abbeys owned entire towns. Really? They collected market fees, issued local decrees, even minted their own coins. You're not quite at that level yet, but you do manage a small village nearby. You know the blacksmith's daughter by name. You helped rebuild the alehouse after a particularly careless fire. You even officiated a wedding between 2 villagers, though you still regret letting the choir perform a polyphonic love ballad during the homily. You also have contracts, dozens of them. Scrolls stuffed into chests, detailing who owes what to whom. There's a particular clause involving a vineyard lease that keeps you up at night because nobody can remember what sunrights meant in that century. You've sent for a canon lawyer to help. He's due in 2 weeks. He smells like ink and anxiety. Now, if all of this sounds exhausting, it is. But it's also necessary. Because without strong estate management, your abbey can't function. The prayers stop when the bread runs out. The education halts when the ink dries up. And the medicine dwindles when the herb garden is overtaken by wild boar. You run a spiritual center, but that spirit needs sturdy walls and warm cloaks. There's also the constant threat of external encroachment. The local baron wants your river access. A bishop's cousin is just visiting and starts grazing his oxen in your pasture. You write polite but firm letters. You send monks with charters to argue your rights. Sometimes you lose. Sometimes you win. And once, memorably, you won by quoting the book of Leviticus in court while holding up a bag of oats as evidence. And the land shall not be sold in perpetuity worked surprisingly well. Historians still argue whether abbots were true land experts or just spiritual men burdened with earthly chores. Judging by your current life, it's clear you are both. You pray, and then you inventory beehives. You chant, and then haggle with a carpenter over the cost of new pews. You write letters about eternal salvation, then rush out to rescue the wheat sacks from a leaking granary. And sometimes, just sometimes, it all pays off. You host a feast after a good harvest. The monks are cheerful. The village kids sing songs. Even the oxen seem smug. You sit at the long wooden table, watching your little community celebrate, warm, fed, safe. The abbey shines in the torchlight. For a moment, you forget the aching ledgers and cracked barrels. You remember why it all matters. Then a novice runs up, holding a slightly flattened pie. Abbot! The chickens got into the kitchen. You sigh. You rise. You go. Because you're the abbot. And this place runs, quite literally, on your watch. You're ankle deep in mud, squinting into the drizzle, when a wagon finally rolls through the abbey gates, 2 days late, one wheel wrapped in rope, and pulled by the most apologetic donkey you've ever seen. The merchant hops down and bows, his hat soaked straight through. The roads were imaginative, he mutters. You nod solemnly, because you've been on those roads. You've slid on those roads. But the wagon's contents? Silk thread. Lamp oil. Peppercorns. 2 bolts of parchment. Finally. Your economy just sighed in relief. Because surprise, surprise, your abbey is a business. Not in the cold-hearted, profit-hungry way of medieval merchants, perhaps, but in a very real, very practical sense. You buy. You sell. You haggle. You budget. And if you don't do it well, the prayers echo through an empty building lit by half a candle and scented exclusively by turnips. Tonight, we go behind the scenes of the Abbey as a financial operation, your medieval corporation, where God is CEO, your middle management, and the economy depends on whether your beekeeper can keep the hives alive this season. Let's begin with income streams. Your money, or rather, your resources, come from a dozen directions. You've got agricultural output from the Abbey's own lands. Wheat, barley, beans, peas, apples, turnips, so many turnips. Tithes and rents from your tenants and satellite properties. Wool and livestock products, a major source of income if you've got competent shepherds and don't mind shearing-related drama. Crafted goods from your monks, ink, manuscript pages, herbal remedies, candles, cheese. And yes, even donations and bequests, where pious nobles offer coin, land, or the occasional entire village in exchange for prayers, forgiveness, and burial rites near your nicest relic. You don't have coin vaults like a royal treasury, but you do keep money in strong boxes, hidden, locked, and closely guarded by you and the bursar, who has all the charisma of a brick wall, but thankfully, excellent math skills. You also maintain detailed ledgers, with entries like: for measures rye sold to Father Elric, 2 silver, 3 copper. Lent 1 copper to Brother Ralph for beehive repair, no expectation of return. It's not glamorous. It's not dramatic. But it's your lifeblood. Trade is where things get complicated. You can't produce everything your abbey needs. So, you buy from merchants who travel the countryside. Some are peddlers with carts full of ribbons and herbs. Others are connected to international trade routes, bringing in spices from the east, textiles from Flanders, or books copied in distant monasteries. You negotiate firmly, carefully. You pay fair, but not foolish. Some abbots treat trade as suspicious, worldly nonsense. You know better. If you want your abbey to function, you need relationships with local and regional traders. You learn their habits, their tells. You know the tanner who always tries to pass off fox pelts as marten. You smile at him anyway, then inspect every hide personally. Then there's export. If your abbey is particularly skilled, say, your scribes produce illuminated manuscripts that make other monasteries weep with envy, you might sell copies. Quietly. Respectfully. Maybe even under the pretense of a donation in gratitude. You once sold a single psalter for more than the combined salary of your entire bee team. You kept that one quiet. Some abbeys go big, leasing out mills, collecting tolls on bridges, running full-scale vineyards. Others play it safer, focusing on high-demand goods, candles, ale, salt, wool. You walk the line. You're not trying to build an empire. You're trying to sustain a community. But you've also got enough savvy to know that selling a barrel of good honeyed mead before Easter brings in twice the coin. Let's not forget festivals and pilgrimages. Got a good relic? Maybe a sliver of bone from a saint with an impressive backstory? That means pilgrims. And pilgrims mean purchases, candles, badges, donations, even accommodation. You don't charge for prayers, of course. That would be unseemly. But if a weary traveler wants to donate a few silver coins for the comfort of your guest house and some hot porridge, well, you're not going to say no. Speaking of relics, here's a quirky twist: some abbots fake them. Not you, obviously. But others? They'd purchase a shinbone from a butcher, wrap it in silk, and declare it the holy femur of Saint Agatha the slightly persistent. You don't engage in those antics. But you do make sure your own relics are respectfully maintained, and you may or may not have exaggerated how often they glow during feast days. Just a little. Expenses also loom large. You've got mouths to feed, candles to burn, roofs to repair, books to replace. You run a charity kitchen, offer alms, fund the local school, and send coin when disaster strikes neighboring towns. Every denier counts. Every broken plough matters. You once held an emergency council to decide whether to sell a goose or repair the cloister window. The window won. The goose was delicious. Sometimes you invest. A new millstone. A better wine press. A windbreak for the outer orchard. These things don't seem exciting, but over time, they pay off. You track costs, results, and, when you're feeling particularly daring, you conduct small-scale experiments, like testing that new drying technique for preserving figs, or having Brother William grow saffron instead of cabbage. It failed spectacularly. The cabbage returned. And yes, there's always the looming threat of debt. Some abbeys borrow to build new structures, buy rare books, or settle legal disputes. You avoid debt like the plague because you've read what happens when it spirals. Monasteries losing land. Families withdrawing donations. That one abbey that mortgaged its grain stores to buy a jewel-encrusted reliquary and then had to beg for oats the next winter. You manage lean seasons carefully. You prioritize needs over wants. You budget for broken things, and you never let Brother Cuthbert handle purchases again after the Golden Thimble incident. Historians still debate whether medieval abbeys were spiritual institutions or economic engines wearing wool robes. But you? You know the answer is yes. You are both. You pray and you profit. You kneel before God and then you balance the books. You tithe to Rome and haggle over firewood like your life depends on it, because it kind of does. And amid all this accounting and transaction, something surprising happens. Your monks begin to understand stewardship, not just of goods, but of purpose. The younger ones learn that a grain store is as sacred, in its way, as the altar, because it feeds the choir. They learn to repair sandals, stretch parchment, preserve apples, conserve candle wax. They learn to do more with less, and to do it with intention. Your abbey becomes efficient, resilient, kind of legendary. So when that sodden merchant finally shows up with his wagon, 2 days late, you don't scold. You offer him a dry cloak, a hot meal, a place to rest. Because kindness is part of the economy too. You log the delivery, share the pepper with the cook, hand the silk thread to the weavers, and smile. You made it through another quarter. And tomorrow, the bees need checking. It's the morning of the feast of St. Benedict, and you're already tired. The bells have rung, the banners are up, and the novices have, despite explicit instructions, not quite nailed the harmony on the entrance chant. Brother Godric burned the porridge, again. Someone dropped a candle on the new tapestry. And you still have to deliver the homily and host the bishop for dinner. Welcome to the strange, beautiful, chaotic world of ceremony and public image. Because being an abbot isn't just praying and planning and solving riddles about missing turnips. It's performing, in a way. It's staging rituals so smooth and so deeply sacred that everyone watching believes, rightly, that the monastery is a holy place worth admiring, respecting, and, yes, funding. It's the medieval version of brand management, only with more incense. Let's begin with liturgical leadership. You are the spiritual head of the monastery, and that means you lead prayer, mass, and all the services in between, 7 times a day, every day, no matter the weather or your mood. You process in with deliberate steps, bow at the right angle, cross yourself exactly as the rule says. Your voice opens the chant. Your presence sets the tone. One yawn from you, and the entire choir ripples like a field of sleepy wheat. You also preach, especially on feast days. You don't give TED Talks, but your sermons are thoughtful, humble, and occasionally sprinkled with dry humor. You speak of patience, obedience, and charity. You use metaphors, sheep, vines, storms, bread. You once compared the soul to a poorly kept herb garden, and the brothers still quote it with fond mockery. But your duties stretch beyond the chapel. You must host guests, nobles, bishops, traveling abbots, merchants, and the occasional overly enthusiastic relic hunter. Hospitality is a cornerstone of monastic life. So you prepare. You clean. You assign monks to kitchen duty and others to guest welcoming detail. You put Brother Thomas on conversation patrol, lest he begin ranting about the filioque clause before dessert. Then there's the matter of public perception. Word travels fast in medieval villages. People talk. The steward in the next village says your monks are too lenient. A passing pilgrim claims your abbey bread is dry. You laugh, but then double-check the oven schedule. Because reputation matters. If people trust your abbey, they'll support it. If they doubt it, the next bequest might go elsewhere. You oversee ceremonies for major events, ordinations, feast days, processions, and, occasionally, funerals. Each one is a layered performance: robes, incense, chants, readings, and rehearsed movements that feel both ancient and brand new. The Feast of Corpus Christi requires precision. The monstrance must shine, the choir must harmonize, and the flower petals must fall at the exact moment the host is elevated. You've rehearsed it 6 times. You still don't trust Brother Edwin with the censer. And then there are rites of passage. A novice takes his first vows. You lead the ceremony, tie the cincture, give him his new name. You make eye contact, just long enough to say, "You are one of us now." The community claps softly. He smiles like he's finally breathing right. You also bless things. A new plow. A family's home. A basket of seeds. A sheep that's about to give birth. A pregnant villager worried about the baby. You hold the cross aloft, speak words older than memory, and trace your fingers through the air. Is the magic real? You don't ask that question. The gesture is the grace. One quirky tradition you maintain: processions around the fields during planting season. You and the monks walk the perimeter of the abbey lands, chanting psalms and sprinkling holy water to protect the crops. Sometimes villagers join. Sometimes it rains. One year, a goat followed the entire way. You named it Gloria. Historians still argue whether monastic pageantry distracted from the spiritual core or expressed it. You've long believed in the latter. A well-kept chapel, a dignified mass, a solemn chant at twilight, these are not flourishes. They are acts of devotion, the liturgy made visible. God deserves beauty. And the people need to see faith in motion. You're also in charge of symbols: what your abbey looks like, what your monks wear, what your seals bear. You choose banners, colors, and decorative motifs. Not for vanity, but for identity. A clean cloak says discipline. A polished altar says reverence. A beautifully written charter, well, it says don't even think about suing us, good sir. One of your favorites. The Abbey Bell. Cast in bronze, it's your voice across the valley. It rings out at dawn, at prayer, at death. People set their lives by its chime. You care for it. You even gave it a name: Pax. When it cracked one winter, you raised funds, rewrote the ringing schedule, and prayed until it was recast. It now sings slightly deeper, but somehow sweeter. And let's talk relic display. You don't put bones under a spotlight, but you do present them with care. You schedule veneration times. You prepare clean cloths. You recite stories. The villagers kneel. Some cry. A mother presses her infant to the reliquary glass. You say nothing, but you're watching, always, to ensure that sacred doesn't slide into superstition. Occasionally, you're invited to public events, dedications, baptisms, even royal ceremonies. You represent your abbey with humility and polish. You speak when asked, bless when permitted, and wear your finest vestments, which are only slightly itchy but undeniably impressive. You've mastered the solemn nod, the restrained smile, the subtle eye roll when a baron brags about his 23 pigs again. Your monks help you maintain this image. They sweep the cloisters, polish the candelabra, copy texts so beautiful that even illiterates gasp at the colors. You train them gently, reminding them that excellence in ritual is not pride, it's offering. You have, on rare occasions, corrected a reading mid-mass with a whispered Latin prompt. You're not proud. But it was Leviticus. It needed clarity. Sometimes the spectacle becomes too much. You feel it in your spine, like you're staging faith instead of living it. On those days, you retreat. You sit in the garden. You smell rosemary. You talk to no one. You remember that ceremonies are tools, not cages. And you return, renewed. Because the truth is, the beauty, the ritual, the formality, it's not about impressing anyone. It's about rhythm. continuity. A heartbeat. In a world of plagues, wars, and hunger, your abbey offers something precious: predictability. The bell rings. The psalms begin. The bread is blessed. The candles flicker. And for just a moment, the world makes sense. So, tonight, as the feast begins and the monks file in, robes pressed, candles lit, psalms rising, you pause at the rear of the chapel. You watch. And you realize, it's working. They're breathing in peace. They're seeing the sacred. And you help build it. The scrolls have been sealed, the chalices polished, and the monks are finally quiet in their cells. But you? You're not heading to bed just yet. You light a small oil lamp and slip into the chapter house with a stack of dusty parchments. Because tonight isn't about God, or glory, or even a decent chant, it's about property law. You are the abbot, and legal authority and land disputes are very much your problem. You may have taken a vow of poverty, but your monastery definitely didn't. Over the centuries, it's been gifted acres of land, mills, fisheries, orchards, and even the rights to hold weekly markets in nearby villages. Managing that land is a full-time job. Defending it? Even more so. In medieval terms, you're not just a man of God, you're a landlord, legal strategist, and occasionally, a courtroom warrior. Let's say a local knight decides that, actually, the meadow your sheep have grazed for 60 years now used to belong to his grandmother. No written deed, of course. Just a story, some charisma, and a slightly threatening squint. Suddenly, you're deep in a boundary dispute. And in the medieval legal system, truth is often just the loudest argument wrapped in the shiniest seal. So you prepare. You dig through the abbey's archive, charters, land grants, royal confirmations, each one a fragile piece of paper that says, "We were here first." You've got maps, sort of, boundary markers, half-eaten by moss, and testimonies from monks old enough to remember when that ditch was still just a rut. Then you ride, yes, ride, to the Lord's court. You sit across from landowners who've never set foot in your chapel but seem awfully invested in your apple orchards. You smile. You present your case. You listen to the other side's claims with the serenity of a man planning 3 moves ahead. And when the scribe records the judgment in your favor, you nod. Not smugly. Just enough to say, we protect what is sacred and what pays for our cheese. You see, monasteries can't operate on faith alone. Your lands pay for bread, candles, repairs, and scribes. When an ox breaks its leg, it's not a miracle you need, it's revenue. And the more land you manage, the more disputes you face. Some are simple. A tenant complains that the steward is overcharging rents. You listen. You adjust. You send a stern letter to the steward with a bonus paragraph about eternal consequences. Some are bizarre. A fisherman claims your monks moved a boundary stone by night. You investigate. It turns out a badger rolled it while looking for grubs. You take notes. You do not tell the fisherman. Some are explosive. A local baron accuses your abbey of encroaching on his hunting grounds. The fact that he wants those woods for hawking, and not feeding the poor, doesn't stop him from showing up with 5 men-at-arms and a very loud lawyer. You de-escalate. You suggest a mutually beneficial solution. And when that fails, you produce a letter bearing the royal seal, from last century. It helps. And what about your own tenants? They're not always easy. A miller refuses to share grain profits. A serf grazes his pigs where he shouldn't. A villager builds a fence across an abbey path. You mediate. You remind them that they benefit from your stability, safe roads, fair prices, generous alms. But you're not always the victor. Sometimes, a powerful noble muscles through your claims. Sometimes the court sides with tradition instead of law. Sometimes a document gets lost, or worse, stolen. You've learned to accept setbacks with grace, and to make copies of everything. One fringe tidbit: some abbots actually trained in law, especially canon law, before rising to their post. You didn't, but you've become fluent in its rhythms. You know when to invoke precedent, when to appeal to custom, and when to simply stare into someone's soul and say, are you really going to argue with St. Augustine's Foundation Charter? And it's not just civil law. You deal with ecclesiastical courts, too. That monk caught with smuggled wine? Canon law. That scandal about a stolen relic? Canon law. That one time two abbots argued over which of them got to use most revered in official letters? You guessed it, canon law. Historians still argue whether that last one reflects deeper rivalries or just bored scribes. You also represent your abbey in royal inquests. When the king sends envoys to assess lands and holdings, you welcome them with hospitality and very careful record books. You walk them through the barns, show off your gardens, and subtly point out that your granary roof definitely does not leak anymore. You hand them documents like they're sacramental wafers. With both hands. Slowly. Then there are charters, the lifeblood of legitimacy. You sign them. You seal them with wax. You sometimes sleep with the most important ones under your pillow, just in case. When new land is gifted to the abbey, you make sure the donation is witnessed, written, and triple copied, and that the donor is sober. Lessons learned. A common joke among monks, he who has the parchment, has the pasture. You laugh. But you also file the joke in your mental vault of legal truth. Words matter. Ink matters. Monks who illuminate manuscripts aren't just making pretty pages, they're defending your future. And while you're usually in the courtroom or the chapter house, sometimes you need to walk the land. You bring a small group of monks, a steward, and an older villager who remembers where the old tree line was. You point, measure with rope, mark with chalk. You've even memorized the smell of the soil at your borders. It's dry with a hint of ash. You suspect someone's been burning brush again. You also deal with inheritance quirks. A dying noble bequeaths land to your abbey unless his nephew objects. That nephew, shockingly, does object. You must now prove the dying man's intent. There's a tear-stained letter. A monk's testimony. A family feud dating back 3 Christmases. You prepare a folder thick enough to stun a goose. The court rules in your favor. The nephew is not amused. You send him a fruit basket. And remember, land isn't static. Rivers move. Trees fall. Boundaries shift. You must be vigilant. A once clear ditch now runs crooked. A road rerouted by rain now veers dangerously close to Sir Reginald's estate. You adjust maps, send notices, and pray no one starts another mini-war. At times, you dream of simpler days, of a little hermitage and a single acre of land. But those days are long gone. Your monastery is a land-holding engine. It needs oversight, strategy, and diplomacy. You provide all 3, plus a decent hand at Latin curses when necessary. So as you extinguish your lamp, the parchment stacked neatly beside you, you lean back and stretch. Your abbey still owns what it did this morning. It might even own a bit more. And no one, not even that puffed-up Ree from Street Aldwyn, can say otherwise. You smile. Because defending land may not be holy work. But it keeps the prayers going. It's barely dawn, and already a monk is knocking gently at your door with a clay tablet and an apologetic look. You know what that means. More correspondence. More decisions. And oh yes, more delegation and management. You stretch, mutter something halfway between a blessing and a groan, and get to work. Because today, you're not just a man of God. You're also a CEO with a monastery full of departments, each expecting clear orders, reliable leadership, and maybe the occasional miracle. First stop, the cellarer's office. He's in charge of food supplies, wine, ale, and pretty much anything edible that keeps the abbey running. You listen patiently as he explains that 2 barrels of pickled herring have mysteriously vanished. Mysteriously, in this case, meaning Brother Arsmond probably got hungry after Vespers. You remind the cellarer, gently, always gently, to improve his inventory ledgers. You don't want another audit like last winter's, when a travelling bishop decided to count the cheese wheels personally. From there, you make your rounds. The infirmary needs new linens. The armarius, in charge of manuscripts, is requesting a shipment of imported blue ink again. The guest master reports that a noblewoman and her 3 chatty daughters are due this evening, and no one is emotionally ready. And still, you press on. Because every monk, every steward, every lay brother has a job. And it's your task to make sure they're doing it well. You're not micromanaging, no. You're overseeing, delegating, empowering, and occasionally correcting. Like when Brother Edric, the beekeeper, tried to introduce experimental hives near the cloister garden and accidentally turned the abbot's daisies into a combat zone. You gently reminded him that innovation is fine, but maybe not so close to the chapel doors. Leadership at a monastery is not unlike running a small city. You have departments, budgets, human resources issues, and production cycles. There's a rhythm to it all, a daily flow that you guide with a firm but flexible hand. Let's talk about scheduling, for instance. The monastic day is ruled by the divine office, the cycle of prayers, chants, and services that divide the hours. But within that sacred rhythm, you must juggle agricultural work, manuscript copying, guest hospitality, and internal maintenance. You delegate wisely. The prior oversees discipline and worship logistics. The sub-prior handles dormitory matters. You appoint a sacrist to manage the church, a precentor to guide the chanting monks, and a porter to greet visitors. You host weekly chapter meetings, where issues are discussed, monks are assigned tasks, and grievances are aired in polite, passive-aggressive Latin. It's a bit like a boardroom meeting if your board members wore habits and occasionally cited Gregory the Great in heated tones. There's also the abbey school, if your monastery has one. You ensure that the boys studying there, some destined for the monastic life, others sent by noble families, are receiving proper instruction. Grammar, rhetoric, theology. And, ideally, fewer ink-stained fistfights. Let's not forget the lay servants, either. They don't wear habits, but they work alongside the monks, baking bread, tending fields, chopping wood. They need housing, wages, or in-kind payments, and supervision. It falls to you to ensure that they're treated fairly and that their work supports the spiritual mission of the monastery. Or at least doesn't accidentally sabotage it. Like that one time the miller tried to repair the grain chute with a chunk of old gospel parchment. He was corrected. Kindly. Firmly. Quirky detail? Some abbots used code words or colored tokens to communicate complex instructions discreetly across large communities. You don't need that. You've got a voice like velvet and a memory like a wax tablet. Still, the idea of a colored bean tracking system does briefly intrigue you. Occasionally, disputes arise. A monk accuses another of laziness. A steward complains that the fish pond is being overharvested. A scribe swears someone has been borrowing his goose quills. You arbitrate. Calmly. Thoughtfully. You quote scripture. Sometimes you quote your mother. You're persuasive like that. But it's not just about keeping the abbey running. You think long-term. You plan expansions, request funding, order repairs, and ensure that when the harvest fails, as it does some years, your grain stores are full enough to feed the monks and the poor. And then there's the travel. Yes, even abbots hit the road. You might journey to visit a bishop, attend a church council, or negotiate a new land lease. That means managing things in absentia. So you train your prior and steward to act in your stead. You leave detailed instructions, half prayer, half operations manual. And you trust them to keep the place upright and preferably unsmoked while you're gone. Of course, some abbots delegate too much. They vanish into the library or cloister and leave all governance to the steward. This can work until the steward starts behaving like a baron and suddenly the choir stalls are upholstered in deer hide. Historians still argue whether this trend of absentee governance led to some of the stricter reforms in later monastic orders. But not you. You delegate smartly. You maintain balance. You even allow room for innovation, like when the brewmaster wanted to experiment with herb-infused ale. The monks grumbled at first, but now they chant a little more cheerfully in the mornings. Coincidence? Let's talk numbers. Managing a monastery also means balancing books. You know how many sheep are grazing, how many barrels are in storage, how many coins are in the treasury. You track it all in ledgers, sometimes personally, more often through a trusted monk with neat handwriting and a suspicious love for abacuses. Once a year, you do a full audit. It's called the view of account, and it involves every official reporting in with scrolls, receipts, and nervous expressions. You sit in the chapter house like a holy CFO and listen. You nod. You ask probing questions. You raise one eyebrow just enough to say, "Are you sure about that barley count, Brother Wulfstan?" And yes, sometimes you have to be stern. When laziness creeps in, or someone hoards apples, or a field lies fallow too long, you step in. But you also know when to praise. You commend monks who go the extra mile, stewards who fix things before they break, scribes who spell every single Latin verb correctly on the first try. A rare and noble breed. You're not managing just a building. You're managing a living organism, one that prays, sings, eats, repairs roofs, copies books, shelters pilgrims, heals the sick, buries the dead, and grows vegetables. It's an ecosystem, and you're the beating heart, occasionally stressed, often tired, but always committed. And sometimes, when the day's work is done and the last bell has rung, you step outside. You look at the abbey. The lights in the dormitory. The smoke rising from the kitchen. The gentle rustle of wind through the cloister. You've kept it all moving. You've led, delegated, corrected, empowered. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. It's well past midnight when the messenger finally arrives, mud-streaked, half-frozen, and barely coherent. But he's got a wax-sealed scroll clutched in one shaking hand, and that can mean only one thing: trouble from outside. As abbot, you're used to managing the delicate life inside the monastery, but every now and then, the world beyond your cloistered walls barges in, loud, chaotic, and usually bearing bad news. You break the seal. Read. And sigh. A neighboring baron is disputing your abbey's claim to a patch of woodland. Again. This is the third time in 6 months he's brought it up, claiming that his grandfather planted those trees. You gently pointed out that your monastery has had grazing rights since before his family had a coat of arms. He responded by having one of your shepherd boys chased off the land by armored men on horseback. Charming. And so begins yet another round of diplomatic letters, appeals to bishops, and maybe, just maybe, a politely worded threat of excommunication. You may live in a world of prayers and psalms, but that doesn't mean you can't go toe-to-toe with feudal politics. In fact, as abbot, you're expected to. Because monasteries aren't just spiritual centers, they're landowners, power brokers, and legal entities. And the land? Oh, it's everything. You're managing fields, forests, mills, and fisheries spread across the countryside. That means you're constantly dealing with feudal lords, knights, bailiffs, and sheriffs, each with their own agendas and loyalties. Some are allies. Others, not so much. And let's not even get started on the tax collectors. You technically don't pay royal taxes, thank you, centuries-old exemptions, but that doesn't stop certain overzealous officials from showing up and re-evaluating your privileges. You once had to spend 2 full days arguing with a sweaty clerk who insisted your sheepfold counted as a taxable barn. Spoiler, it didn't. You made sure of it. In triplicate. But sometimes, the challenges come not from greedy lords or nosy officials, but from within your own ecclesiastical hierarchy. Remember that bishop who helped fund your cloister's new library wing? Now he wants to send his troublesome nephew to serve God under your wise guidance. That's code for, please take this overly ambitious 20-year-old who has already tried to rewrite the Psalms. You smile. You nod. You accept the gift. And then you assign the nephew to kitchen duty. For humility, of course. Sometimes, entire legal battles are fought over one forgotten cart path or a sheep pen built 6 inches too far east. And while the monks chant softly in the choir stalls, you're consulting maps, rereading charters, and planning your next counter-argument. It's like medieval courtroom drama, only slower and with more incense. Historians still argue whether monasteries became too entangled in secular affairs, risking their spiritual focus. But from your perspective, the outside world is an inescapable part of your job. You're not just protecting the monastery's interests, you're protecting the community that relies on you for food, shelter, and spiritual guidance. Speaking of which, the local peasants. They look to you for help, especially when the baron's men trample their crops or when a poor family can't pay rent. You offer what aid you can: grain from your stores, coins from your almoner's chest, a word with the local reeve. And when things get really bad, like during last year's famine, you open your gates. You share what little you have. You make sure no one starves on your watch. And word spreads. People start calling your monastery a sanctuary, not just in the spiritual sense, but in the very real, hay-smelling, bread-providing sense. That reputation matters. It protects you, too. Even the most belligerent knight hesitates to sack a place known for feeding orphans and healing the sick. Still, not all danger comes with horse hooves and tax rolls. Some of it arrives on ships. You get reports of a plague outbreak 2 towns over. No one's calling it Black Death yet, this is a few decades too early, but the symptoms are bad enough. You act fast. Isolate the sick. Lock down the guest house. Send your infirmera strict instructions, and maybe a couple extra casks of wine to keep his spirits up. Quirky historical footnote? Some abbots issued plague coins, money boiled in vinegar before use, as a kind of medieval disinfectant. You try it once. It smells awful, but no one dares question your methods. That's leadership. Sometimes the threats are more political than pestilential. One particularly ambitious noble hints that he might take an interest in your abbey's affairs. You smile diplomatically. Then, very casually, you mention your friendship with the local archbishop. And that rumor that said noble's cousin tried to fake a relic? You might have helped spread that. Just a little. Because here's the thing, as abbot, your power is real, but so are your enemies. You learn to play the game. You bless people with one hand and defend your turf with the other. And when the occasion calls for it, you know how to spin a story just right to rally public support. Remember that baron and his trees? You circulate a gentle tale of how your monks planted those woods to honor St. Cuthbert, who once cured a child there. Is it technically verifiable? No. But it is spiritually compelling. And very effective. Still, you never let the politicking consume you. Your heart remains in the cloister, with your brothers. You're not a warlord. You're a steward, of land, of lives, of faith. But oh, it's a delicate balance. You spend your days navigating a maze of land rights, legal wrangling, clerical politics, and occasional peasant drama. You even hire a notary monk to keep records of every agreement, land transfer, and grumpy correspondence from the diocese. His handwriting is tiny. His eyes are worse. But without him, you'd be adrift. And when the pressure gets too much, when it feels like the world is spinning a little too fast, you find your escape not in strategy, but in solitude. You walk the cloister garden. You watch the bees in their hives. You sit beside the carp pond and listen to the wind moving through the reeds. And somehow, that's enough. You go back in. Ready to write another letter. Make another call. Defend your monastery with a pen, a prayer, and, when necessary, a very firm voice. Because being an abbot isn't just about kneeling at the altar. It's about standing your ground, in every sense. You don't wear a crown, but don't let that fool you, you hold court just the same. Monks seek your advice. Nobles seek your blessing. Peasants seek your judgment. And like any CEO with a reputation to maintain, you quickly realize that perception is as much a part of your job as prayer. That's right, it's time to talk about public image and reputation management. No one calls it branding, of course. But deep down, you know that what people say about your abbey when your back is turned matters a lot. Because if your monastery earns a reputation for being greedy, lax, or corrupt, it's not just a hit to your ego. It's a hit to your influence, your donations, and even your security. So, every word you speak in public, every decision you make in private, every rumor that slips down the hill and into the tavern, it all builds or breaks the image of your abbey. Take the simple matter of how you receive guests. When a minor noble shows up unannounced, muddy boots, sour mood, too many squires, you still greet him warmly. Offer him ale. Smile as he complains about the roads, the bishop, and his gout. Because while he might be a nuisance today, next year he might donate a dozen sheep. Or better yet, a new roof for the scriptorium. And don't forget the power of hospitality stories. Word spreads fast when a monastery gives a weary traveler bread and shelter. It spreads even faster when the monks sing him softly to sleep. Suddenly your abbey is that generous one near the river, and pilgrims start showing up with hopeful eyes and empty stomachs. Now, you're not faking kindness. You genuinely want to serve. But you've also learned that kindness, repeated and remembered, becomes legend. And legends build loyalty. Speaking of legends, let's not overlook the carefully curated saintly relics on display in your chapel. Are they authentic? That depends on your definition of authentic. One sliver of wood is said to be from the true cross. Another is a thumb bone, of whom exactly, no one's entirely sure. But it's displayed with reverence, polished brass, and a heavy dose of incense. Visitors don't come for carbon dating. They come for wonder. For awe. And you make sure they get it. Quirky historical tidbit, some abbeys even staged a miracle reenactments, complete with costumes, props, and choirs. You tried that once, Brother Elric dramatically rising from a pretend deathbed thanks to a drop of holy water. It brought in the crowds. And the donations. And a mild case of stage fright for Elric, who now prefers to copy psalms in silence. But reputation isn't all theatrics. It's also scrutiny. Other monasteries watch you. The bishop watches you. Rome definitely watches you. So when a monk is caught sleeping through matins or sneaking honey from the cellar, you act, quietly, firmly, and always with an eye on how it looks from the outside. Discipline must be seen to be fair, not harsh. You're not running a boot camp. You're running a holy household. And yes, sometimes you make strategic moves purely for reputation's sake. Like that year you sent extra food to the neighboring priory during their bad harvest. You didn't have much to spare, but you knew they'd remember. And they did. A few months later, their cantor sent you a beautifully illuminated hymn manuscript as thanks. Now that's networking. You also maintain relationships with local leaders, abbots, priors, even rival bishops. It's not always warm and fuzzy, there's a lot of veiled compliments and passive-aggressive Latin, but it's important. When scandals break out, and they do, even in the church, it's good to have allies who'll say, well, our dear brother Abbot would never do such a thing. Even your physical appearance becomes part of your image. You wear robes of fine, but not ostentatious, wool. Your crozier, the abbot's staff, is carved and capped with modest silver, not gold. Your expression? Thoughtful, serene, perhaps with just a hint of I haven't slept in a week. People trust a leader who looks like he's carrying weight. And there's the annual Abbey Fair, which you've carefully turned into a minor regional event. Merchants set up stalls. Minstrels perform. You arrange for public readings of scripture. One year you even had a puppet play based on the life of Saint Anthony, complete with a very enthusiastic pig. Word spread. Now, people look forward to the fair as much as they do the harvest. Historians still argue whether medieval abbots used public events more for spiritual outreach or PR. You'd say, why not both? Because at the end of the day, you're not just protecting a building or a field or a library. You're protecting an idea. The idea that here, within these walls, people can find peace, purpose, and maybe a little bit of porridge. And while not everyone can visit your abbey, your reputation travels further than your messengers ever could. Nobles write about you. Pilgrims speak your name. Other abbots emulate your decisions. You even once received a thank you letter from the Queen's confessor. You didn't even know she had a confessor. But apparently he'd heard of the time you opened your cloister to the plague-stricken villagers when no one else would. Now, that story lives on in whispers and songs and the occasional badly carved woodblock print. It's not why you did it. But it does mean that next time you petition the bishop for new altar cloths or protection from a land-grabbing knight, you're starting from a place of strength. Respect. Recognition. You know your abbey's reputation is fragile. One scandal, one poorly handled dispute, one monk caught dancing in the cloister fountain, and it could unravel. So you stay vigilant. You cultivate not just virtue, but visibility. And in doing so, you ensure your abbey's legacy survives, not just this season, but for generations. Because long after your bones are buried beneath the chancel floor, people will still speak of the wise abbot who kept the peace, led with grace, and somehow turned a patch of English mud into a beacon of light. And that's a legacy no crown could give you. The parchment arrives with a royal seal, and your heart does that strange little leap it always does when politics gets too close. You crack the wax, scan the lines, and there it is, clear as a summer sky, you're being summoned to attend a synod. Not the kind you can send a proxy to, either. This is a big one. High-ranking abbots, bishops, even cardinals will be there. A gathering of the church's sharpest minds and, let's be honest, most finely tailored egos. You sigh. Then you start packing. You'd prefer to stay tucked behind your monastery walls, breathing in parchment and beeswax, deciding how many leeks the kitchen should plant this year. But being an abbot doesn't just mean overseeing a community, it also means representing it. And sometimes that means hitting the medieval conference circuit, robes and all. You ride for days, mud, rain, a saddle sore or two, and finally arrive at a grand cathedral town humming with voices, incense, and political tension. Because that's what these gatherings are, half holy convocation, half strategic chess match. The synod of wherever it is this time isn't just about debating theology. It's about policy, property, precedence, and, occasionally, who gets the best seat at dinner. There's a pecking order, of course. And while you're no bishop, your abbey's reputation, remember that miracle story, gets you seated comfortably near the center, where the serious decisions get made. You nod solemnly. You whisper greetings in Latin. You notice which abbots have new rings, which bishops have gotten older, and which of them brought an entourage of suspiciously well-fed acolytes. The debates begin. First, the relatively tame stuff, liturgical reforms, calendar clarifications, whether fasting rules should apply to eel stew. You argue yes, but no one's quite sure. Then come the heavy hitters, property disputes, accusations of lax discipline, and oh yes, the ever-persistent issue of monastic independence. Because you're not just managing a spiritual retreat. You're defending your abbey's autonomy. And there are always those, especially among the episcopal crowd, who think your monastery should report directly to the local bishop, not the pope. You, naturally, disagree. Strongly. Historians still argue whether abbots were truly free agents or just subtly tethered to higher church authority. In this moment, surrounded by murmuring voices and the smell of old stone, you feel the tension tightrope under your feet. Speak too boldly, and you risk alienating allies. Stay too quiet, and you risk ceding ground your predecessors fought hard to win. So, you do what abbots have done for centuries, you thread the theological needle. You praise the unity of the church, the wisdom of the bishop, and the need for local flexibility. You quote Augustine, always a crowd pleaser. You remind everyone that your abbey has followed the rule faithfully for generations. And, most importantly, you remind them that if your monastery thrives, the whole diocese benefits. It's not a knockout blow, but it's enough to earn nods and keep the wolves at bay. After the synod breaks for the day, you retreat to your lodgings, Spartan but clean, and write updates to your monks. You miss them. You miss the garden, the silence, the simplicity of deciding where to plant beans. But this is part of the role. These moments on the wider stage help protect everything you're building at home. And, surprisingly, not all of it is struggle. You get to hear new chants from distant abbeys, swap tips on sheep breeding with a Cistercian from the north, and even share a laugh with a Benedictine who tells you he once accidentally served beer instead of holy water at a blessing. Very lively service, he says. There's camaraderie here, even among the veiled power plays. You see it in the quiet nods across the room when someone mentions caring for lepers or building new schools. You're not the only one shouldering too much. You're not the only one lying awake some nights wondering if you've made the right call. And then there's the politics. Some abbots curry favor openly, lavish gifts, sweet words, backing every bishop's suggestion like a trained parrot. Others play a subtler game, silence, smirks, and strategic absences. You've chosen your style, measured, thoughtful, just humble enough to disarm. And while no one says it outright, you know the others are watching. That's why, when a motion comes up to reduce the number of feast days, for the sake of productivity, you raise an eyebrow. Fewer feast days? Less singing? Less dancing around the refectory with almond tarts? You gently suggest that joy has spiritual value too. A few monks quietly clap. You may have just saved Michaelmas Pudding Day. Not all synods end in harmony. This one drags on. Old grudges flare. A bishop accuses a monastery of hoarding relics. Someone quotes Leviticus in a voice like thunder. You sip your watered wine and remind yourself, this too shall pass. By the end, you've won some ground and ceded a little, too. You got the forest boundary issue postponed if a win, but lost the debate over new Latin phrasing in the Easter liturgy, a draw. You're tired, but you kept your abbey's name in good standing. And in a world where memory is everything, that's gold. Before you leave, you visit the cathedral. Just to sit. Not to lead. Not to speak. You kneel on the cold stone and let the silence wrap around you like a wool cloak. For a moment, you're not an abbot. You're just a man, whispering prayers into a space where thousands have done the same. The journey back is long, and your horse seems as over it as you are. But when the gates of your abbey finally come into view, golden in the evening sun, bees humming lazily in the air, it's like exhaling after a long, tense note. Home. The brothers gather to hear your news. You deliver it over supper, between spoonfuls of lentil stew. You downplay the drama. You highlight the good. You leave out the eel debate. Some things are better left unsaid. And as you watch them smile and nod, as you hear the rustle of habits and the faint clatter of bowls, you realize something: representing your abbey isn't just an obligation. It's a kind of pilgrimage. One you make with ink, with speech, with presence. And you do it again tomorrow, saddle sores and all. There's a strange shift in the air this year. It starts with the whispers, soft, cautious, passed in corridors and cloisters. Then the messages arrive, urgent, official, a little too vague. Then come the visitors, papal envoys, bishops with tight expressions, monks who speak in low tones and refuse second helpings at supper. You've been abbot long enough to recognize the signs. The church is changing, again. And just like any CEO facing a disruptive market shift, you realize it's time to think fast, tread carefully, and read between the lines of every parchment that crosses your desk. Sometimes the change is theological. A new interpretation of doctrine, perhaps. Or the subtle elevation of one sense cult over another. Sometimes it's organizational, a new bishop in the region with a taste for micromanagement. Or Rome sending out feelers about consolidating certain rural houses into centralized priories. Sometimes it's unsettling. Like the new order you've just been told to accommodate, young monks with shaved heads, thin sandals, and fire in their eyes. They call themselves mendicants, and they want nothing to do with property or routine or comfy monasteries. They preach in the streets. They challenge corruption. They say the church should be poor like Christ. You try to keep an open mind. After all, you're not some medieval tyrant clinging to power. You believe in renewal. But when the local friars build a makeshift pulpit just outside your gates and start denouncing lazy monks living like princes, you feel a tight knot coil in your stomach. Because whether you like it or not, you've become the establishment. And in times of reform, the establishment becomes the target. Historians still argue whether these reform movements strengthened or fragmented the church. From your perspective, it depends on whether the new guys leave enough bread for the old monks. You're not against reform, you just want it tempered with wisdom, not burned like kindling. But reform isn't just external. You feel it in your own community. Young monks arrive who question everything. Why do we chant this psalm at Vespers and not that one? Why can't the poor eat in the refectory during feast days? Why are we copying this 200-year-old treatise no one reads? They're not wrong, exactly. But they're restless. You remember being restless once. You try to listen. To guide. To steer their fire into something more lasting than protest. Some days, you succeed. Other days, a scroll gets set on fire by accident. It's not just ideology. It's technology, too. Yes, even in the 13th century, tech moves fast. A new style of bookbinding. Better ink. Illuminated letters with pigments imported from Constantinople. And then there's the big one, paper. Real paper, cheaper than parchment, lighter to carry. Made from linen rags, of all things. You remember your first sheet of it. You held it up to the light, skeptical. Could this flimsy thing really replace good old cheap vellum? But the scribes love it. And the novices can copy twice as fast. Soon you're ordering bales of it and wondering how long until you run out of storage space. Every innovation brings opportunity and risk. The more books you can make, the more ideas you can spread. But not all ideas are friendly. Some books contain satire, heresy, criticism. And once they're written, they travel. You find yourself reviewing texts more closely, asking Brother Anselm twice whether he really needs to include that spicy marginal note about bishops and wine. You adapt. You evolve. Because at your core, you are a builder. Not just of walls and dormitories, but of systems. Traditions. Ways of life. And the only way to keep building is to absorb the tremors without letting the structure collapse. You begin holding more chapter meetings. Not just to lecture, but to ask. What are the brothers seeing in the village? What are the novices hearing from traveling preachers? You start listening more. Not because you're losing authority, but because shared leadership creates resilience. You also invest in your monks. Not with coin, but with education. You arrange for some to travel and study with renowned scholars. One comes back quoting Aristotle in Greek and refuses to stop. Another brings back a new musical notation that simplifies chants. You implement both, and yes, you eventually tell the Aristotle monk to dial it down at meals. Because even as the winds shift, you don't let go of the helm. There's a phrase you start repeating to yourself when things get shaky: stability breeds strength. It's in your rule. It's in your bones. It doesn't mean resisting change. It means anchoring it. You let the water flow, but you make sure the channel's well dug. Still, not every reform is gentle. One year, a new edict arrives, mandatory tithes from monasteries to help fund crusades. You try to negotiate. Your grain stores are already stretched. Your roof leaks. Your infirmary needs repairs. But the crown insists. The bishop nods sadly. And just like that, you're funneling silver toward a war you neither started nor control. You don't protest. But you quietly rebalance your budget. You skip building that guest house this year. You ask the cook to halve the honey ration. You donate less to the priory down the hill. It hurts. But it keeps you afloat. Because this, too, is adaptation. Strategic, measured, often invisible from the outside. And through it all, you model the one thing no scroll or edict can mandate: calm. You walk slowly. You speak gently. You write thoughtful letters. When a worried novice asks if the abbey will be shut down by next spring, you smile and say, "Only if we forget why we're here." He smiles back. He keeps copying psalms. You make a note to praise him at chapter tomorrow. And maybe that's the biggest secret to surviving reform, remembering that you're not just preserving a building or a budget, you're shaping the souls within it. And that can't be done in a hurry or a panic. So when the next wave of change crashes over your abbey, and you know it will, you'll do what you always do: listen, discern, adjust. Then you'll pull on your cloak, pick up your staff, and head out to tend the bees. Because some things, like honey and hope, are timeless. You wake before the bell, even though no one asked you to. It's not nerves. It's habit. And maybe something else, something stirring low in your chest, hard to name. Today, something changes. It's subtle, like a leaf turning over in the wind. You light your candle, wrap your cloak around your shoulders, and step into the pre-dawn stillness of the cloister. The air has that crisp bite of late autumn. You hear a single owl, far off, and the faint shuffle of Brother Thomas waking up 3 doors down. The monastery is alive, but drowsy. As it should be. But you, dear Abbot, you're already thinking several steps ahead. Because today, for the first time in decades, you're not thinking about long-term planning. You're not organizing the scriptorium or negotiating grain taxes or fielding polite threats from the bishop. Today, you're planning your exit. Not a dramatic one. No robes tossed in rebellion, no final sermon echoing off stone walls. You're not being ousted or censured. No scandal lurks in the margins. But your hands ache more than they used to, your walks take longer, and your once crisp memory sometimes skips like a scratched wax tablet. You are, in every sense, nearing your twilight as abbot. And, like any wise CEO, you know that succession matters just as much as strategy. Maybe even more. Historians still argue whether monastic leadership transitions were smooth or chaotic. You suspect the answer depends on preparation. And so, quietly, steadily, you've been preparing. For months now, you've been watching one monk in particular. Not the loudest. Not the most pious. Certainly not the one who wins every debate in chapter. But someone who listens, who stays late in the scriptorium without being asked, who once spent a whole winter perfecting the kitchen's beer recipe just to stretch the barley ration. That kind of attention to detail? That's gold. You haven't told him yet. You don't want to spook him. He still thinks he's blending in. He has no idea he's about to inherit one of the most complex jobs in Christendom. You chuckle softly at the thought. Poor lad. Still, before you can make anything official, there are procedures. First, the chapter meeting. You gather your senior monks, each of whom has seen you at your best and at your very sleep-deprived worst. You explain your intentions. You quote the rule. You lay out the timeline, a year, maybe 2, depending on how the transition unfolds. There's silence, then a murmur of prayerful assent. No one's surprised. Then come the letters. To the bishop. To Rome. To neighboring abbots who might send observers or offer guidance. You phrase everything carefully, grateful, humble, but clear. The abbey's leadership is entering its next chapter, and you're here to steward the handoff with grace. Because an abbey is not just a workplace. It's not a retirement villa. It's a legacy machine. Every decision echoes for generations. Every book copied, every herb grown, every novice trained. And the person sitting in your chair after you will inherit the whole web of choices you've spent a lifetime weaving. No pressure. You begin easing up on certain tasks. You let others take the lead during meetings. You invite more questions. You don't stop guiding, but you make space. Slowly, you let go of the reins with one hand, then the other. It's not easy. You catch yourself correcting things mid-sentence. You still rise early to check the inventory ledgers, even though you've technically handed them over. You find yourself halfway to the fields before remembering that Brother Anselm now handles crop rotations. You're learning to step back, not vanish. The difference is key. Some monks worry. Will the new abbot be too young? Too lenient? Too eager to impress Rome? Others worry less and start casually asking for permission to repaint the dormitories. Change always brings opportunists. You've got a few pranksters penciled on your mental watch list. But amidst the noise, there's peace too. You walk the cloister more slowly these days, taking time to notice the way the ivy curls around the arches. You spend longer in the scriptorium, helping the younger scribes learn the older, fussier lettering styles. You sit beside the infirm and just listen. These small things were always important. You just never had time to see how much. Sometimes you think about the monks who came before you, the abbots whose names are carved into the wood of the choir stalls or tucked at the margins of centuries-old ledgers. You wonder what they feared, what they regretted, what they hoped would outlive them. You say their names out loud sometimes, just so someone remembers. And late one night, standing by the old beehives, you finally admit it, you're ready. Not to leave the abbey entirely, no, you'll remain a brother here until your final breath, but ready to let someone else lead. Ready to trust that what you built won't crumble the moment you stop steering. You write one final report for the archives. Not a formal one. More of a letter. You write about what surprised you most. What you wished you'd done differently. What you're proudest of. You fold it neatly and seal it, placing it in a drawer only the next abbot will open. You also include a recipe for nettle tea and a warning never to let Brother Paulus handle roof repairs alone again. The day of the formal announcement arrives. The refectory is full, the air buzzing with anticipation. You speak briefly. You thank your brothers. You name your successor. There are no gasps. Just a stillness, like the abbey itself is holding its breath. And then they sing. Not because they're happy you're leaving, but because transition, like dawn, is sacred. The hymn rolls through the stone walls, soft and steady. A chant older than your abbey, older than you. You feel tears prick your eyes, but you let them stay. This isn't an end. It's just a handing on of the lantern. Later, you sit with your chosen successor. You talk plainly. You don't sugarcoat the hard parts. But you remind him, too, of the joys, the quiet harvests, the candlelit vigils, the time the novices accidentally dyed all the laundry green. He listens. He nods. He'll be fine. As for you? You finally return to your cell, not the large one you had as abbot, but your old novice's room, with its creaky bed and view of the goat pen. And it feels just right. You settle into a rhythm again, prayer, reading, gardening. The occasional scroll of advice when requested. Sometimes you catch a glimpse of yourself in polished bronze and barely recognize the lined face staring back. But it's okay. You earned every line. And sometimes, when the new abbot is out inspecting the granary, the brothers still come to you. Not for decisions, but for memories. For stories. For the quiet reassurance that comes from seeing someone who made it through, mostly intact. You remind them, this life was never meant to be easy. But oh, how worth it is. And in the evenings, you sit by the window, watching the candlelight flicker across the cloister, and smile. The abbey is safe. The future is in good hands. And for the first time in a long while, you have nowhere urgent to be. The seasons continue their quiet loop. Snow softens the cloister roof, then melts into spring moss. Wheat turns golden and sighs in summer wind. The abbey keeps breathing, bells ringing, hands praying, bread rising, whether or not you're at the helm. And that, oddly enough, brings a strange kind of peace. You've become the quiet brother now. The one sitting in the herb garden with a lapful of rosemary stems. The one children from the village wave to without quite knowing why. Some call you father, out of habit. Others, old brother. A few just say, the one who remembers everything. Because you do. You remember the fires and the floods. The endless tax debates. The time the bishop's horse got stuck in the cloister well. You remember when the scriptorium got a second window and the monks cheered like it was the second coming. You remember the bees, of course. And the novices who used to sneak honey by pretending it was for medicinal reasons. You remember building all of it, not just with bricks or books, but with time. Quiet time. Tedious time. time you gave freely and never expected back. And now, as you shuffle through the garden with a creaky knee and a content heart, you realize the oddest truth of all: you don't miss power. Not the title. Not the meetings. Not even the comfy Abbot's chair with the secret drawer. What you do miss, sometimes, is the rhythm. That sharp morning pulse of decision-making. The subtle maneuvering. The satisfaction of pulling off a complex feast day without the sausage running out. Being Abbot was like conducting an orchestra that never stopped rehearsing. And you were good at it. Historians still argue whether abbots were administrators or spiritual guides. You know the truth, they were both. And also farmers, diplomats, therapists, project managers, and, on more than one occasion, emergency roofers. You still get called in sometimes. A scroll gone missing. A novice with cold feet. A fire in the kitchen chimney, again. You go, of course. You listen. You advise. Then you slip back into the background before anyone can start calling you Abbot again. Because your job now is to let things go. You attend the new Abbot's feast day with your hands folded and your mouth shut. You smile as he gives a speech you once gave, with different words. You nod as he blesses the bread with a voice still finding its depth. You watch as the community around you shifts its roots, not torn up, just replanted a little. This is what lasting things do. They adapt. You write a little, now and then. Not treatises or grand theological works. Just notes. Reflections. Maybe one day, someone will stumble on them and laugh at your handwriting or marvel at your spelling of miracle. Maybe they'll keep copying them anyway. One morning, you catch yourself humming the old entrance hymn as you trim the vines along the cloister wall. A young monk pauses nearby and listens. When you stop, he asks you to teach it to him. You do. Slowly. Repeating the notes until they stick. And just like that, your voice passes into the next generation, not as an order, but as a memory. The abbey endures. Not because of any single abbot, but because each one knew when to hold on and when to pass the torch. You've seen other monasteries crumble under pride. Leaders who stayed too long. Successors chosen for politics instead of principle. Communities fractured by gossip or ambition. And yet, here you are, under ivy-covered stone, where the psalms still rise and the bread still bakes. You must have done something right. You're not immortal. No one is. One day, your candle will flicker out like all the others. But the point was never to live forever. The point was to build something that could. You find yourself sitting at the edge of the cloister walk, watching bees drift lazily in the sun. One lands near your foot and preens its wings like a cat. You smile. You trained your successor well. You even passed on the bee recipe, though you did leave out the bit about the medicinal honey stash. Some secrets are best left as inside jokes between old monks and heaven. You close your eyes and listen, not just to the bees, but to the voices behind the stone walls, laughter, chanting, the scrape of a broom on flagstone. The living heartbeat of something bigger than you, yet shaped by you in every breath and brick. And in that quiet moment, you realize, being a medieval abbot wasn't just like being a CEO. It was something deeper. Something stranger. Something sacred. It was holding together the fragile, glorious chaos of faith and food and politics and bees and parchment and prayer, and somehow making it hum. And now, your work is done. Wind down 300 words. So, you stretch your legs out a little. Let the robe bunch up around your knees. The sun's dipping lower, casting long shadows across the cloister garden. The vines rustle faintly. Somewhere, a bell chimes, not urgent, just a soft reminder that evening prayers are near. Your fingers trace the edge of the bench, the wood worn smooth by decades of sitting monks, yourself included. And there, in that still moment, everything slows. You did what you were called to do. You took the abbey through years of storms and seasons, through growth and loss and the quiet, humming repetition of monastic life. You made choices, some wise, some less so, but always with the future of your brothers in mind. You built not just structures, but rhythms. A way of life. A heartbeat that will keep echoing long after you're gone. The bees return to their hives. The vines tremble once, then settle. The air thickens with the scent of earth and bread. You exhale, slow and steady. And in that breath, the centuries melt away. Maybe being an abbot wasn't glamorous. Maybe it was quiet, thankless work most days. But it mattered. You mattered. The abbey still stands. And if someone, hundreds of years from now, lights a candle in this same chapel, chants the same psalm you once did, or hums the same tune you taught the novice in the garden, then that, dear listener, is a kind of forever. So rest easy now. Your part in the song is over. But the song continues.